Hey guys, this is EdRoh. First off, I want to say thank you for 100k subscribers. The support you guys give me keeps me motivated to create these builds, and as a way of giving back, I want to start a series of more beginner-focused contents if you guys like it. So today we're basically going to dive into mastering CSS from beginner to advanced. Because you guys liked it so much, I've made another one like this to be more practical and hands-on. And the whole point of this course is that I see a lot of beginners trying to master every little detail about CSS, spend way too much time memorizing all the properties, getting stuck on little edge cases. But my goal is to make sure you skip all that noise and focus on the most essential aspects of CSS and get you to a point where you can actually just start building applications. So this guide is about pretty much all CSS, no distractions of HTML or JavaScript. So it is good for complete beginners just to start building. So in this application, we're going to be building this landing page, and we're going to go through all the steps of CSS. Even if this is your first time, we're going to go through and build this entire application. I'm going to make this simple and easy to do with a step-by-step process. And after we build these applications, we're going to even be hosting this on our hosting websites. So to showcase our work, we want hosts. And for today's hosting, I highly recommend Hostinger, the sponsor for today's video, especially since they're offering an incredible Black Friday deal. So go to the link in the description. The URL link is hostinger.com/EdRoh, and you'll see this page, and we just want to hit claim deal. And here we have premium, business, and cloud startup options. We can start from premium, which allows you to create 100 websites with 100 gigabyte SSD storage, provides free domain and free email as well. It also has a lot of security, and I'll say it has a very nice UI that you can use to set up your website. So from here, I'm going to hit choose plan. Now you're going to see this page, and we're going to look at the period of time we want. So we're going to choose 48 month to get the biggest discount. We're going to select have a coupon code, and I'm going to type EDROH or EdRoh. We're going to hit apply for an even bigger discount, and note that this deal is for Black Friday, so there's not that much more time on this sale. So make sure you don't miss out and take advantage of this deal soon. And we're going to hit continue. And then from here, create your account. Once you finish creating your account, you're going to see this page, and we're going to skip. We're going to create a website, hit next, and from here, instead of choosing one of these, we're going to do empty PHP HTML website. And for our domain name, we can just do amazing CSS mastering application.com. So we have that free for 1 year. We can just hit next. And then make sure you figure out where your target audience is located. I'm just going to leave it as default. Once that's done, you should be able to see your dashboard with your website, and we'll come back to this at the end of each application. So the first application we're going to be building is this simple yet elegant educational landing page. Through this, we'll cover the foundational and most important CSS properties, and this project is intentionally designed to be simple so we can focus on mastering the essentials. Basically, the core CSS properties that really matter. Now, my goal here is not to overwhelm you with an endless list of cool or advanced CSS tricks. They're not what you need majority of the time. We're going to be emphasizing on the CSS properties that are most essential, the ones that you'll use every single day. There's only so much you really need to know about CSS, and everything else you can just learn as you go along. So let's get started. So for this tutorial, you're going to need a code editor, and the one I recommend is going to be Visual Studio Code, which is the most popular. So make sure you download this on whichever platform you're using. All right, so from there, let's open up VS Studio Code, and inside your VS Code, we want to open up the directory where you're going to download the assets for this project. In the link in the description, I have this starter kit with App 1, App 2, and App 3. So this is where we are starting these applications. It's not going to be completely from scratch, but we're going to have basically a little bit of a starter code so we can actually focus on CSS. So before we do anything, we're going to open up this tab right here, which is the extension, and you're going to type live. So what you need is, I already installed this, but it's called Live Server. This is going to allow us to start up an HTML and CSS server up and running easily. So have that open, and once you have that, you're going to have this go live button. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up index.html and styles.css, and we're just going to hit go live. So once that's open, it should be opening up to a specific URL. In my case, it's localhost :5500/app1/index.html, but it should open up to whatever makes sense for your port. So you can use that, and if not, you can just write this and it'll take you to that page. Also, this is optional. You can go to extension and you can go prettier. You can install this one right here, prettier code formatter, and this will automatically format your code when you hit save, or you can make it auto save every few seconds. So this will force a consistent style. So if you ever see me write code and I hit Control S or Command S, it's going to save and it's going to auto format. You're just going to see that automatically happening without me doing anything. So it's up to you if you want to install it. And finally, one last thing we want to install is going to be Pesticide for Chrome or for whatever browser. I know Brave browser has the same thing, but basically this allows you to see different, it allows you to visualize elements on the screen. And we're going to be using that, and I'll be talking about this a little more in depth later. All right, so I'm going to close this tab up and we're going to open up index.html. So we aren't going too much into HTML this course, but I'm going to briefly explain it. That HTML, if you can think of it, is the structure of a house. It's the framework that basically holds everything in place, like the walls, roofs, and rooms. Whereas CSS is like the paint, furniture, and decorations. It makes the house look good and feel inviting. So basically together, they create a complete and functional home. And you'll have essentially these HTML elements. We select them using selectors, and we can style them by using those selectors. So basically that selector is the connection between HTML and CSS. So for example, if I go into body, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more so you guys can see better. I'm going to create something called a div tag, and I'm going to just say hello. So we have a hello tag right here. This is the foundation. This is basically HTML. And then from here, we can go to styles and we can select and style this hello via something, let's say div, for example. And I'm just going to say color is going to be, let's choose blue. And now you see that is a color text of blue now. So what we have here is basically an element selector. And basically I'm doing this, I created this comment via command / or controls / depending on your system. And this is what's an element selector is. But there are a couple other selectors. There's also universal selectors, which include something like this, which selects everything. And we can just say background color, which is going to be obviously the background. Save it, and we can change the entire background of a different color. Now, typically, this is not what you would do. You would just set this to be padding of 0 and a margin of 0, because we'll cover this a little bit later, but every browser has some default CSS settings, and you always want to reset them. And most of the time, you want to reset something like padding and margin, so that makes it easier to handle later on. And something like this is called a universal selector, because it basically selects everything. Now you only use it once per application, but you generally use it at least once. And then we use element selectors for selecting various things, but we can also set the body, which is going to be this particular element right here, the body over here. Every web page basically has a body tag at least once. And we're going to give this a background color of F7, F7, F7. This is a gray color, so it's a little darker than just white. Generally, for any website, you generally don't want to use straight white because it's a little jarring. You generally want to use a slightly off color of. Now, we'll talk about this shortly, what this actually is. This is a hex color. We'll talk about it in just a little bit, but let's, for now, ignore that. And I'm going to just set the color to be 333. And this will change the color of body tags over here. All right, so we're going to remove this div color blue because we're not going to be using that. And we're going to go back to our index.html, get rid of this div because I just wanted to demonstrate it. But the first thing we want to do is create something called header, which is another HTML tag. And we're going to have a class called hero. And I'm just going to say hero like this so you can see the hero text. Now, this class is one of the ways we can select different elements in our entire application. So if I go back to the styles.css, I'm going to go over here and I can write .hero. Note that this is not just like body where there is no dot. Anytime we are selecting something via class, we always need to do a dot. And this is the way we can target specific elements in our application. And we can say, of course, color should be red, something like that. So we can obviously see what it's like. And there we go. We have a red text color and it's targeting specifically the header like so. And this right here is called a class selector. And this is probably the most common selector you're going to be using. And it's going to be probably 90% of your application in terms of selecting. Now you can look at this and say, why not use the header tag? You can use the header tag, but what if you have more than one headers? Because you can use the same header like so. And let's say you just want to say header 2. If you wanted to target header, you're going to be coloring both of these. But what if you just wanted to have a different color for hero and then a different color for header 2? This is not going to work. That's why you have a class that you need to target specifically for a specific header. So we're just going to erase that. Then we're going to start creating our application. So what we want to create is going to be this part right here. So this section, we're going to ignore the nav bar because that will be more advanced stuff. But for now, we're going to focus on this text right here. And we're going to ignore the background. We're just going to focus on this to make it easy. So to do that, we're going to create an H1 tag. So this is a header 1 tag. So basically the largest type of text you'll have on your application. And it goes from H1 through H6. But for now, we're just going to do H1. And we're going to call this hero 2 underscores title. And I'm going to call this empower young minds, like that. So right here, what we have is a class with a subclass right here. It's not really the name, but there's a specific way of naming. We call it BEM. We'll talk about this later, but for now, we just have to know that this is a different class from this one. So we can target specifically the H1 tag. So from here, we're going to go back to styles and we're going to change the hero color. We're just going to remove this for now. And then I'm going to create another class called hero 2 underscores title. I'm going to call this color and we are just going to set it to black for now, for the time being. So now that we can see that the color is specifically targeting our title. But this is also in the wrong spot. There is some space around it and it's kind of centered. Now there's something called padding where we can kind of do exactly just that. So going back to our application, we can go into the hero section right here, this hero, and we can add some padding like so with 100 pixel. So that is going to give us some space between the edges and this text right here. So if you take a look, if you have the pesticide, you can see that there is a box around this and the text is within here. And this right here is going to be 100 pixel from the top, 100 pixel from the bottom, 100 pixel from the left. That is exactly what this needs to do right here. And we're not done yet. We're going to go back to index.html. I'm going to scoot this up so we have more space. And I'm going to create a p tag. So there's H1 through H6, but there's also p tags, which was allowed us to do. Basically write the most common normal type of text types, and it's generally the smallest text type, but you can configure it the way you want to and style it different ways. So over here, we're going to do hero 2 underscores description like so. Close this out. I'm going to just write some text. This can be whatever text you want because this is not a real application, but we're just going to write some text that seems like it will be plausible with our application. And we're also going to create something called a span, which is not spa, a span right here like this. And we're just going to write innovative like so and have educational platform. So we have a p tag And then we also have a span tag. And in this span tag, we're also going to create a class. And we're going to call this hero underscore highlight. And the reason why we do this specifically is so that we can target this text separately from the rest. But first, let's go back to styles. And under .hero underscore title, I'm going to write .hero underscore description. And we are going to use a color, and this is going to be a hex color, 81DA76. This is specifically a yellow type of color. Now, if you look at this, you can actually hover over and you can see this color picker. So basically this will choose a number of colors, and this is based on hex. So hex is a way of choosing our colors, basically 6 values. And this is the most common way of choosing colors. Whereas, you can use the default colors like this, but you're going to be severely limited when it comes to designing very nice looking applications. Now this is great, but we also want innovative to be a different color. Now if we go back to our application, we can see that innovative is a different color. It's almost white. That's exactly why we put a span over here. And we called it hero highlight. And if we just choose it, we can do .hero underscore highlight. And we're going to give it another color, and we're going to give it kind of a slightly white color. Like so. If we go back to our application, you can see it's not very visible right here because we don't have the background, but we'll take care of it. But as you can see, we have targeted that specifically. Now we have been using classes. There's actually another type of selector that people used to use a lot more, but now it's not very common, but it is called an ID tag. So if you go back to our span, I'm going to change this to an ID like so. So now when I save it, it's not going to work anymore. That's because we have to change this dot to a number, or this hashtag. Once we save that, that will be back to white. And I'm going to call this ID selector. Now, one thing to note, the difference between class selector and an ID selector is that ID selector can only be used once, so that this can only target one element in the entire application. This used to be a more common thing, but now you never know when you're going to reuse another selector, a set of classes, or you might want to use hero highlight on some other element, but then you can't do it with ID. Then you would have to go back, switch this to a class. So that makes it kind of annoying. And there's another property of IDs that it is way more specific than classes, but we'll talk about specificity later because that's a much more advanced topic. So for majority of the time when you're selecting elements, you generally just want to use class. It'll make your life easier, and there's no real downsides to just consistently use classes over IDs. That's just my opinion. Some people might disagree, but I generally see no problems with just continually using classes everywhere. So there's universal selector, element selector, class selector, and ID selector. These 4 types of selectors are the most common type of selectors you're going to be using inside CSS. Now there's other type of selectors, and we'll come back to it later on, and we'll talk about those later. But these 4 are the main ones, and if you know this, you know majority of the selectors. So from here, this is optional, but I'm going to go up to the top of this, just add a little section so we can just separate our topics via the name. So this was the hero section, the top part, and this is all about selectors. And then from here, we're going to go down to the bottom. We're going to go to the next section, which is going to be the fonts. So what we're going to be building for this part is going to be a list of text right here. And we're going to ignore this image for now, but we're just going to have this list of text, and we're going to be talking about different properties of fonts specifically. So from here, I'm going to go to the index HTML page. And here we're going to create a section. We're going to call this with class, with feature like so, and close it. And inside this class, we're going to create another div, and we're going to call this class is equal to feature 2_ container. Close that. And inside here, we're going to have another div, and it's very common to have a lot of hierarchies of divs, and I'll come to show you why we're doing all of this. And in here, we're going to call this feature item, close that. And inside here, we're finally going to add an h2 tag with the class. And we are going to say feature 2_ title. And this is something we haven't done before, but we're going to give this 2 classes. You can give any element more than 1 class. So that's exactly what we're doing right here. And in this case, we're giving it another tag called feature_title -- selected. And I'm going to write empower student learning. Save it so we have that text over there. We can see it popping up. And over here, we're going to have a p tag. I'm going to say class is equal to feature_description. And I'm going to close this. Now over here, I'm just going to copy and paste this text. You're free to add whatever text you want. So you can pause it and look at this and copy this if you want to, but you can add whatever text you want. Now, if you check here, we have a lot of layers of elements and a lot of elements nested within each other. So the feature is going to be considered a parent of the feature container. This is the child of feature. And then the feature container is the parent of feature item, and feature item is the child of feature container. This is very important to note that all these element tags have a parent-child relationships. And for many different type of elements, this is a very important relationship to really understand. So let's turn on pesticide, and I want to give this example. If you look at our previous example of our hero section, we have this outside container. This is the parent of these 2 children elements. If you see the header, this is the parent, and these 2, are the children of this header. That means everything that we have in the parent will get inherited by the child container. So if we set like a color of, for example, these text in the feature or the feature container, then these 2 will inherit that color. This is a very important relationship to understand. So let's write dot feature, and let's just say we give it a color of blue violet, something like that. We can see that even though this is the parent container, both of the child items are colored blue violet. This is a very important thing to really understand when you talk about CSS, that everything shares a parent-child relationship. All right, so we're not actually going to use that color because it's a bad color for this project, but we're going to instead say font family. So font family, we're going to set this to Poppins, Times, and Serif. So basically, these 2 fonts have changed after I added this font family. So basically, we are using a different type of font. Now, I have Poppins as the main one. So if you go to index.html, that is coming from this particular link. Google Fonts has a number of free fonts that you can use, and Poppins is one of them, and you have to make sure you import them. Now, if you take a look, I have different weights. Now, I'll come back to this, but if you have too many weights, it's kind of bad. But this is how you import different fonts. And this right here, Times and Serif, these are basically backup fonts. For example, if Poppins didn't exist, if we didn't include that link, the Times and Serif will be activated, and these will be the fallback fonts that we have. So for whatever reason, sometimes it falls back, doesn't have the font, or we can't see it, then we're going to use the fallback. So now we are going to use this font family for everything. And like I said, with the parent-child relationships, this actually applies to the entire application. So instead of putting it in dot feature, we're going to move it into body because we want to apply it to everything. So that includes the beginning text as well. So like I said, parent-child relationships, this is a parent of almost all the elements in the entire HTML page. So that is why we put it there. All right, from there, we're going to do a few cleaning up things, we're going to add a padding, 100 pixel for dot feature. And then we're going to go to dot feature underscore item. And we're going to give that a padding. Now I haven't done this, but this is a shorthand. If you want padding of 30 pixel only from the top and bottom, we want 30 pixel top and bottom and 0 on the left or right. We don't want padding on the left right axis. You can do something like this. If you only set 2, you are going to set the pixel 30 pixels from X and Y, or sorry, the Y area. So there is a space, but we have not shown that there is some compatibility, but let's comment that out. You can see it does move downwards because there's like a little padding like so. If I remove it, you can see there was no padding anymore, like that. So that is how you can set the pixels or the padding top and bottom and not left and right. But now, if you look back on our index.html, we want to change the text of the title. So we're going to use that particular class. We're going to do dot feature underscore title. And I'm going to say a font size is going to be 32 pixel. So this is a way to set the size. Pretty self-explanatory. You can use pixel. You can also use something called EM, which makes it ginormous. And then REM, which is relative EM. Now, a lot of people have this thing where if you use REM, you get a more consistent result. 32 pixel is fine, but you can instead use REM to make it consistent across browsers. And the reason why that's consistent is because this is a unit of measurement that defines an element's size relative to the font size of the document's root element. So if the root element is 16 pixel, then REM is based on those 16 pixels of the root of the browser. So it really depends on what you're going for. I think maybe 2.2 REM is pretty good for this. We're going to just leave it like that. And then there's also font weight. We can set this to be 500. And this determines how thick the text is for this. So I can set even 200, that's very thin. 900 is very thick. So for this case, 500 is pretty good. We can also use something called text transform. And this is often, you can just write the text to be uppercase here instead, but you can also put it in your CSS so you don't have to deal with doing that, especially when your text is really long. And then, of course, we're going to use color. Color will just change the color of the text that we have. And then there's something called margin. I talked about padding a lot, but margin is slightly different. And that basically adds a margin bottom of 10 pixel. So it is different from what we see here. So this is all padding. Padding is within the box. There's like a box around each element. Padding is within that box element, whereas margin is outside. So if I were to do margin top, let's give it 100, let's do 300 so we can see the difference. This is outside the box right here. So this is going to represent the box outside for the top of this section. Now we'll come back to what margin, the real difference between margin and padding, but it is important to understand that each element has its own box. And we'll cover that in the box model section. But for now, we're just going to leave it margin bottom of 10 pixel. And then finally, we want to modify feature title selected, which is the second class that we added. And we're going to set this to be text decoration to be underline. So that's going to give an underline for our text. Now I'm going to go very quickly over other properties via feature underscore description, like so, and we can add a number of properties for this. There's something called text alignment, And this determines something like where the position of the text could be. My mistake, text align. So if I do that, this gets centered in this particular way. Before it was aligned to the left, now it's going to be center. You can also set this to be right. Then there's also letter spacing. And we can just say 0.5 rem. And obviously this will just space out the text. You can use that if you really need to. But all of these properties that I'm writing for this description are not as common. You can use it if you really need to. Line height, let's just remove that. Line height is, let's say, 1.2 rem. That's going to determine how much space it is between each line. So like 2.4 rem gives it more space. Word spacing is pretty self-explanatory. So if I do 3 rem, you're going to have a lot of space in between your text. And then white space is going to be a way we can set different settings around whether how white space is collapsed or whether how lines wrap. So if I do no wrap, for example, you're obviously going to see that it's just going to continue on that line even if there is like a box element. We can also do pre, which has different settings. There's pre-wrap. And there's also all of these kind of things that are kind of, a little bit different. There's some that I've never ever used, so I'm not entirely sure some of them. So you want to go to the MDM docs if you ever feel like you have that need. And this is one of those things where you do it when you get to the point of needing it for something like this. You don't need to memorize this. And that's very important to stress because there's a lot to learn in, programming. So you don't want to spend too much time trying to memorize something that you'll probably use once in a moon and no one's going to test you on. And one last thing to note, I just wanted to add this. So REM, I don't think I explained this carefully enough, but pixels is an absolute unit of measurement, meaning the font size will always remain the same on different screen sizes. Whereas REM is going to be based on the screen size. So it's best to use REM if you possibly can. You can use pixels for fonts like that, but REM is preferred way for different font sizes. Now from here, this is only one section, so we're just gonna go over here. We need to add feature item so we can have the same thing 2 more times. And I'm gonna select feature title -- selected. I'm gonna hit Control D or Command D depending on your system. I'm gonna select both of these, get rid of them so we don't have underline for the next 2 sections. And we can just change this to streamlined communication tools. And also I'm gonna copy and paste this text that I already have. You can pause it, write this, and just remember you can write whatever text you want. And then over here on the last one, we're going to do customizable learning experience like so. And I'm going to copy and paste this last text. You can pause it, take a look, and see what all of these text is. And as you can see, we have those new text being applied over here. And this is why we use classes. Again, once more time, feature item, we can use it multiple times like this. If we did it with ID, this would not work. Same thing with title and description. All right, so from here, we're gonna go to the color section. So the colors is going to be the call to action section that we have here. So learn more about those content. We're gonna talk about colors mostly. So I'm gonna save this. Go back to our index.html, and we're gonna write our. I'm also gonna comment this out just so, or not comment this out, add a little comment of each section like so. We have the same comments for the HTML and not just CSS. So we're gonna go down over to section, make sure this is in the right location. So that's the one downside of HTML is that if you have a very long HTML and you have a lot of nested, it gets kind of hard to figure out where your elements are supposed to be. So make sure everything is done correctly. So over here, I'm going to create a section with class being CTA, like so. And inside here, we're going to add an h3 tag with class being CTA underscore title. Close that. And I'm going to say learn more about us by contacting us. Below this, I'm going to have another p tag with class is going to be CTA underscore description. Make sure you spell that correctly. And we're going to close this. And inside here, it's going to be a random set of text like we normally do. And I'm going to go back to our UI and we can see that we have the text. It is not styled. And we also need one more thing, which is going to be a button. So we're going to use the button element, which is named appropriately button. And then we're going to do class is going to be CTA underscore button. And then CTA underscore button dash dash primary. Like so. Close this and we're going to say learn more. If you take a look, we have a button, kind of ugly, but we have a button that works. Now back to our styles sheet, we're going to go and we're going to add CTA. We're going to give this a padding of 100 pixel. So we have some space like we normally do. Basically reset. And then over here, I'm going to say background color is going to be 5BB471. So now right here, what you see is a hex color with here. This is a 6-letter code that represents different colors. So you can go and scroll down, see different colors, and you can scroll and change the opacity, which is like how transparent the color is. And then also you can change the hue if you want to. Now there are different ways that we have color pickers. This is just one way that VS Code provides that you can use to set the different colors by dragging things around to figuring it out. You can also use color pickers on the internet. There's Adobe has one, and there's a lot of tools for stuff like this. So you can use any one of those. And as we've also seen that you can use stuff like, the default text color like black or I don't know, blanched almond, stuff like that. They all have different colors. But then there's a couple that we missed or we did not talk about, and that includes something like RGB. So this is a way of specifying different colors, which is from 0 to 255 for 3 different colors. So let's say I do 32, 45, comma, 45, 50. This is just random numbers that I don't know exactly what color this is, but we're getting something that's close to being black. Actually, let's do this. There we go. Yeah. So we have a color, 3 colors. This determines how black a certain color is. So if you change this, you can see that there's different hues that we can do. Once again, similar to how we were doing before, and we can save it, have different colors. So RGB is an alternative way to do it. The main advantage of RGB is not RGB itself, but something called RGBA. So you can actually specify the opacity. So if you want something that's kind of transparent, you can do something like this. So 0.3, and that's using the same color. If I just choose 1, that's the default, but we can make it half its color hue. So that is the purpose of RGBA. That's the main advantage of using that type of color picking. And finally, the last one, which I don't see being used too often, is HSL, which you are determining the color via the hue, saturation, and lightness. And H is a number from 0 to 360. Saturation is from 0 to 100%, and lightness is 0 to 100%. So let's say I just do something like 200. Saturation is going to be 50%, and we can do lightness of 100%, something like that. And we get, in this case, we just get white. So if I do 50%, we're going to get a different color like that. So hue determines like the type of color. Saturation depends on how saturated it is. So something like this is 100% saturation. And lightness is depending on how much black there is essentially. So this is just an alternative way. Sometimes it's nice to see the colors in that way, but a lot of times you're just going to use a hex color that you get from some other tool. So in this case, we're just going to go 5BB471, something like that. That should be good. And we're also going to have a color FFF. And sometimes there's a shorthand. You can see you only use it for like white and black. But if all the colors, if you have something like 6 different letters that are all the same, you can shorten this to 3 letters like that. And you should be able to see this is a white color. So the only hex colors that you probably want to see is black and white. So white is FFF, white or black is 3 zeros. So all zeros. And then finally, we're just going to do text align here. We're going to set this to be center, like so. So everything is centered, including the button. So pretty straightforward. Colors are not too bad. It's just when you design it, colors, choosing the right colors for your project, that is the hard part. But do note that for design elements, the most important thing is use as few colors as possible, probably like 2 colors, 2 or 3 main colors that you use for any kind of website. So that is just kind of a good standard. You don't want to use too many colors. That is what a lot of amateurs end up doing when they are trying to design their own website. The description is just going to be kind of a light gray color. And also, if you look at the button styling, we're just going to cover this real quick. We want the color to be none because button elements have a default styling to it. And we just kind of want to reset that. And there's also a little bit of a border. So we're going to do that. See that the button does not have that border anymore. The color is no more. And we want to select our button that we added a class. And that should be padding of 10 pixels top and bottom and 20 pixels left and right, like so. And one more thing I didn't cover about this shorthand with the padding, we can do something called the padding shorthand where it's 4 elements. So it goes from clockwise, starting from the top. We can do something like 30 pixels on the top, 5 pixels on the right, 0 pixels on the bottom, and then 20 pixels on the left. I just want to show you this is not what I want, but you can see there's 30 pixels at the top, 5 pixels on the right, 0 pixels on the bottom, 20 pixels on the left. So this is very handy, so you don't have to do padding left, padding right. You can do something like this if you want to. So that is a shorthand, but we're going to stick to 10 pixels, 20 pixels. And by the way, I do use all those shorthands commonly for padding and margin. They're very common things to use. So the next section is going to be the box model. Now, a lot of people who teach CSS don't seem to talk and stress about how important the box model is to understanding the layout of the entire page. It is very much the essential part of any CSS and HTML. And it is the foundation where everything else comes into play. So if we take a look at this diagram right here, we have several boxes within it. But basically, anytime we have elements in HTML, it's going to include a margin, a border, padding, and content. The content has a width and a height. But then it also has padding, like I mentioned. Then there's also the ability to add a little border around this padding and content. And then there's a margin outside. Margin and padding are just spacing between in different sections. So the padding is between border and content, so you can have some space in there. And you can also have space between margin and the outside. And generally these are for, layout purposes, so you have spacing between items. Because if you have more space, it tends to look better as opposed to just it being cluttered all together. Now, this is a very important concept because it's best to think of any HTML page in boxes and everything else is layered around that. So for example, if you take a look at the final application, you can see all of these items right here. They are encased in boxes, and they have some paddings and margins, and everything has some kind of layout based on boxes. Everything is a box. Everything has padding, everything has margin, everything has some of them actually have borders like these buttons right here. And understanding that every element has this box, you can see how things are related to each other. So there's like space between here. There's an element over here. These are stacked on top of each other, but there's some margin in between. As you can see, there's some spacing in between this and this right here. So everything has this box layout. And it's important to understand that as we talk about Flexbox. But for now, when you set the width and height, which we haven't talked about, any element you can set the width and the height. So if an image has a width of 300 pixel, the image content is obviously going to be 300 pixel wide long. But that doesn't include the padding or the border width. So those are excluded from the equation. But sometimes people like to include border and padding as part of the width because it makes more sense to them. Because if you have an image with a border and some padding, generally you want that image to be 300 pixel, but you want the border and padding to be included in that 300 pixel. That's where people use border box. So the default is content box. As we can see, the width and the height is representative of the content. Whereas for border box, you set the width. That includes both border and padding, like you see right here. It's a little confusing on this image, but right here we have border and padding and the content as part of the height and the width as part of it. And generally people do this for many reasons, and a lot of people do set this. You do box sizing and you put it on the universal selector, and we set this to be border box like so. So it won't change anything in our issue because we have not really set the width and the height, but essentially it will make it so that when we include padding, when we include border, and we set the width and height, it is also included. Because it can be a point of confusion, because you want to think of anything margin is on the outside, border and padding is part of the content, essentially, content width and height. So hopefully that makes sense. So to understand it a little better, we're going to look at this section, Grow Your Child's Future. This is a video section, but we're just going to have an image over here, and we're going to learn a little bit about how the box model works. So I am going to go to our code, go to our HTML, and under the section closing tag, we're going to have box model video section. We're going to add a section element. We're going to have a class, call this video like so, close that section. And inside here, we're going to do an h3 tag with the class of video underscore title. And we're going to say grow your child's future like so. And we're going to go to our text right here. And as you can see, we have that. We're going to add a p tag with class is equal to video underscore description. Close that. And again, I'm going to copy and paste this text. You can write whatever you want. And below this, we're going to have two buttons. We're going to have a div called class is equal to video underscore controls. Close that. Add a little button with class is equal to video underscore button and video underscore button dash dash primary. Close that. And we'll have an I tag. This is for icons. And we're going to add FAS and an FA dash book. This is going to be an icon that we've added. This is based on the class. So if you scroll up, go to how we have this style sheet. This is Font Awesome. It's an easy way to add icons, and we can just add them through a class tag. By doing that, you get a little icon with the book right there. We'll style this in a bit. But right now we're just going to say learn more, like so. And I'm going to copy and paste this for the second one and change this part to secondary. This is going to be FA play dash circle, and we're just going to say watch video. And then below this, I'm going to say div with the class is equal to video underscore container, and close this off. And we're going to go to styles.css, and we're going to go and write video, do text align center to center everything. And then below this, I'm going to do padding is equal to 100 pixel, and font weight is going to be 500. I'm going to continue on. I haven't saved it yet, so nothing is reflected. I'm going to say a font size of 32 pixel, font weight of 500. Then I'm going to save it. You can see we have different elements. We have the padding, we have everything centered. We changed the font weights and stuff. And we are going to also change the video underscore description as well. And this time we're going to use margin dash top with 10 pixel. So we go here, we can see that there is 10 pixel difference between this and this. So as you can think about this, this is right here is its own box. But providing a margin top, that is meaning that we have a 10 pixel between this box and this box right here. Whereas padding is more different. Padding is, you can think of it more as part of the original box. So if I do 10 pixel, it's still part of this box. We saw some space inside here, whereas margin top is more outside that box. So that is a very important distinction that comes into play later when we talk about Flexbox a little more. But for now, I'm going to get rid of the padding because we don't need that. We're just going to say font weight of 300, and we are going to say a color of 6E, 6E, 6E. And we're going to include a few more selectors. We're going to say video button. That is going to be, actually, there's another one, video underscore controls. We're going to have margin dash top colon 20 pixel. And I messed up the O right there, so make sure you have that. And for the button, we want a border. And this border shorthand is what you'll use majority of the time. You start off with the size of the border. So it can be any kind of pixel. Generally use pixel for this because it's easy to do. Then solid. This can be dashed, or it can be dotted, or inset, like so. So this will just make it look like different ways. But for now, let's start with solid. And we're going to say 5BB471, like so. And we're going to give it a background of none and padding of 10 pixel top and bottom, 20 pixel left and right. And we're going to scroll down, and let me get rid of that. And as you can see, that is our box with the border right there. Then we have a background of none, padding 10 pixel top, 20 pixel on the left and right. So again, this is part of the box, and that is included as part of the border is included as part of that box, as well as the padding. Whereas if we change this to content box, this would be very different. That would mean the padding would be on the outside of the basic rule of thumb for this is that when it's a part of it, when you want to include the padding and the border as part of the content, you want to use padding. If you want spacing in between two different boxes, that's when you use margin. Okay? Remember that. And then let me just do dotted just so you can see. Let me get rid of that. You can see there's a bit of a dot. Let's actually increase this so you can see the size. So that is dotted. You can see dashed as well. It's the same thing. And solid is essentially what we were doing before. Those are the main ones. A lot of times you're just going to use solid because dash is not a very, and then from here, I'm going to do dot video underscore button dash dash primary. We're going to give it a margin dash right of 10 pixels. So we have more space between both of them. And dot video dash underscore container. We're going to set margin top of 20 pixel, background color of CCC, like so. It's close to white, with a width of 100% and a height of 500 pixel. And if you look, we have our box right here. So essentially, we go back to our video container. This is a separate element in our video section, and the height is going to be 500 pixel, which is pretty straightforward, but the width is going to be 100%. Now, when we give a width of 100%, you might assume we have 100% of the entire page. However, it's 100% width that fits in the parent container. Again, the parent-child relationships is very important for something like this. So right here, even in this section, it's a little hard to see, but this right here, grow your child, all of this is under video. This entire section is the video class. And all of these are child of that video class, including this. And that video class actually has a padding of 100 pixel that we added earlier. So if I remove it, now the width is the entire width of the entire page. But because we added padding, that is 100 pixel within that element. So this 100% is going to take the width of as much as possible of the parent container, but the parent container has a padding, so it never exceeds that. That is why this width of 100% makes sense for something like this. And it will always, even if you shrink it and open it, it's always going to take that amount of width. So again, this is very important for parent-child relationships. You're going to be using with 100%, height 100%, stuff like that a lot, and you have to understand that they're constrained by their parent elements. So let's say if the video, for example, is a width of just something really small like 100 pixel, if we set that, we're going to see that it's very constrained in this. This is the parent component now, or parent container, which is .video, which is 100 pixel, and everything inside that is constrained to that. You can't even see. Even if we do 500, it's still constrained. You can see that we have this, but it is still dependent on the parent container. But for now, we're just going to keep it like this. That includes the entire width of the page. And the last thing I want to cover is shadows, because it's part of the box model almost, but it's not really. It's just a way to make like shadows behind this box. So we're going to add it for a video container. Now, there's a couple things. I'm going to use this tool right here. Now, you can use whatever tool you want. There's a couple things to note. When you add a box shadow, you have this box shadow colon. Let's ignore these two for now. And there's a number of pixels like this, which makes it a little confusing. And then RGB is going to be the color of the shadow. And as you can see, this is an example. This black part is the shadow itself. First off, we have a horizontal length. So that is just going to represent where the shadow is in position to the original. So that's going to change the first value. And then there's also the vertical, which is up and down. Pretty self-explanatory. That's going to be the second value. And then there's going to be the blur radius. So right now, as you can see, it has a very sharp edge. You can change the blur radius easily via this slider. So sometimes you want a more blurry one, less blurry, up to you. And then you can just change the spread as well. This is how large the shadow is. You can make it huge, but sometimes if it's too huge, it doesn't look correct. Sometimes you could just put this to be 0, like this, or just put it like 1, for example, and you can just space it out from here. So it just shadow from the front. So it just depends on what you want. And obviously the color is just going to be the color of the background. So sometimes you can just make a glow like this, changing like the background color. So sometimes you want to make it glow. Sometimes you can just use it for something interesting like that. But for now, we're just going to keep it to black. We're going to keep it decently blurry like so. And we want to make it a little lighter. Sometimes you just want a subtle radius. So it's very subtle background like that. And with that, we can just copy this box shadow, paste it over here in our video container. And we can see we now have our shadow. Pretty straightforward. There's a lot of settings, but you can play around with a tool like that. It's helpful to use a tool for something like box shadow. Otherwise, it's a little confusing. But yeah, pretty straightforward. All right, so from here, we can now talk about Flexbox. Flexbox is a nice way to lay out a lot of elements. So right now, we've been relying on text align center and putting gaps and paddings for a lot of those. But Flexbox is a way to handle much more complex scenarios compared to just simply centering. Now, if you take a look on this page, this is the final application. For example, the nav bar has these two elements as well as these four elements separated by a space. Now, if you take a look, we have this box and we have another box, and this separates both of these. We use Flex for something like this for laying it out, as well as something like this where we have three different items spaced out in a nice format that spaces out our items. You cannot do something like this when you use just text align center. So the link in the description, there is a Flexbox cheat sheet that you can use. You can use any one of these, but these are so nice for something like Flexbox because there's a lot of properties, but a lot of times it's very nice to have something that shows you visually what's happening. Now let's start. And right now it's a little overwhelming if you see something like this, but there's a couple things that we want to look at. So when you use Flexbox, there is going to be the Flex container, which is going to hold all the items that we're talking about, and the Flex items. Now those Flex items are going to be either on the cross axis, which is up and down, and the main axis, which is left and right. And we want to be able to generally place items next to each other, left or right. And there's different settings that you have for this setup. And we have a few properties that are quite important. Flex direction determines whether you want this default main axis cross axis, or you can set it up in the vice versa. You can set the left and right to be the cross axis and the up and down to be the main axis. And then you also have justify content, which will space things out left and right and have different settings. And align items will space it out on cross sections. So now before we go through all of these properties, it is best we just start with the basics and we start with our code laying out our items in a symmetrical manner with Flexbox. So let's go back to our HTML. I'm going to create a new section, call this Flex with program sections. I'm going to put section with class is equal to programs. Close this out. And inside here, I'm going to have an H2 tag. And I'm going to just write explore our state-of-the-art facilities and enriching learning experience. And then below this, I'm going to have a div with a class of programs, 2 underscores, cards like this, and another div like so with class is equal to programs underscore card, and close this out. And we're going to set 2 more of these inside this. So right now we should just be seeing the H2 just like this, but we're going to change this up. Go to our CSS. I'm going to write programs with a padding of 100 pixel, background dash color with EEE, padding bottom of 200 pixel. So we're going to have a lot of that. And we are going to do dot programs underscore cards. And what we need to do is, as we saw in our Flexbox cheat sheet, we need to identify our Flex container. So this is the parent element. So as we saw in our HTML tag, we have program cards. This is going to be our parents, and the program's singular card, that's going to be our child. So the way we do this is we want to do display Flex on the parent, and then do justify content with space between, like so. And we're going to do gap with 20 pixel and a margin top of 20 pixel. Now, if I save it, we're not going to see anything just yet because we did not identify our program card, which we have not given it a height or a background color. There's no content in it, so there's nothing to be shown. So we're going to start off by saying the background color is going to be B5, B5, B5. Give it a padding of 30 pixel. We're going to give it a width of 30% and a height of 400 pixel. Now, if we save it, we are going to see 3 different boxes, and they are going to be placed right next to each other. This is Flex in a nutshell, the most common Flex example that you can see. When you put display Flex on the parent, and then you can set, that allows you to set properties like space between, which means that inside this parent container, all the elements below as part of the child element, they're going to be spaced equally between them with a gap of 20 pixels in between. Now, if we click pesticide, we can see that we have a lot of these elements, and each of these elements are spaced equally between each other. So as long as you set a specific width or setting for the child element, you're going to be able to see the items being displayed out in the way that Flex is centered. Now, if you take a look, there are multiple properties that you can do with justify content. Now, if we go back to our cheat sheet, we can visually see what the end result of a lot of these properties will be. So if I scroll in, we're going to go to the section with justify content. And as you can see, we have space between, which is what we are using. Space around is similar, but it has some gaps on the end. Space evenly is similar to space around, except all space is the same. Flex end is just going to put all the items at the end of our container. Center is going to center them, and Flex start is going to put them at the beginning. So let's go through and let's see what all of these will do. Space around. So now if you can see, we have an actual gap at the very end. It's small, but it's there. Space evenly will get you something like this. It's a little bigger because it's spaced more evenly out. Flex start, as you can see, there is no gap at the beginning. So there's just going to put a gap of 20 pixels. It's just going to put this on the left, and there's a space at the end. Flex end is similar with the end. And center is just going to put everything in the center. If I change this to width of 10%, you're going to see everything is centered. It'll be much more drastic. So pretty simple. But a lot of times you're going to use maybe center and space between and maybe space around. Those are the most common ones, but space between is where I use the most, and this is most likely what you're going to be using. And another property that you're probably going to use is going to be align items, and you generally want this to be center. Now we can't see this here, but let's say I set this to be a height of 700 pixel. Sorry, you should put the height on the programs cards instead. Now you can see what's happening. This height is a cross-axis. So if you set the height to be 700 pixels, the align items, if you center them, it's going to be in the center of this entire height. So that is exactly what align items is basically doing. And as you can see right here, flex start puts it at the top of the container, center in the center, flex end at the bottom, space between, space around. Now the space between and space around only happens when you have more than one row, but most of the time you're going to just be using center. Center is the most common one. You just want to vertically align everything in the center just like this. We're going to comment that out, and I'm just going to erase the height. So we just have this as the content height. So this is all we need. So I covered justify content space between and align item center. Those are the ones you're going to mostly use, but there are a lot of other properties. I'm going to go through this very quickly because we're going to go through it a lot in app 2. But for now, I'm just going to briefly cover a lot of this. So starting with flex direction, we're going to start with row, which goes from left to right. You can change it right to left if you want, and then column from top to bottom. This is very useful for like columns where you have like a sidebar or something like that, or you want to display and move things out from like they have some space between and you want it automatically and dynamically. So it's useful for a situation like that, but I'll cover that later. And then we also have flex wrap, which allows us to wrap items onto the next line. Now, a lot of times you can use flex wrap for something like this. If you have, in our case, we just have like all of these items on one space. If these took up like 2000 pixels, that's going to obviously go onto the next line. Generally, you would use grid in those situations, but we'll cover that later. But basically, if you use wrap, it's going to put this item on this. And then you can say it, display inline flex, but a lot of times you never use inline flex. There's also align content, which is different from align items. This is when you have multiple items per row, or like you have multiple rows. But a lot of times, like I said, you'll probably use grid instead for situations like that. So that was all the parent container properties. Then there's like individual flex item properties, like we put on the program dash underscore card. So if you have more than one type of card, in our case, all the cards are the same. So we just have one CSS, but if you want to style them differently, you can use some of these flex item properties to make it different. So flex grow is a situation where you can have something like it'll grow 2 times the value if it does not have enough space. So in our case, if you have something like width of 10%, but if we change this to flex base or flex grow to be 1, it's going to try and take as much space up until it takes up 1 unit. For each of these, it's going to take 1 unit, and there's 3 of them. So they're going to be split evenly among all these properties. So that's what flex grow does. Flex shrink is something similar, but it's going to shrink with the value of 2. It shrinks 2 times more than the rest if you set it up. And flex basis is just a better way to set the width in a flex, and I'll cover that more later on, but you can instead change this to be flex basis of 10%. I'm just going to remove the flex grow, and you're just going to get 10% like this. And order is something you don't have to worry about. It's more for responsive design, but you should just handle it as you go along. There's a lot of properties, and I know I covered a lot of the extra properties really quick, but we'll go through more of them in the app too. And also, just know that justify content space between and align item center. This is the most commonly used set. I use this a lot, and this is the most, if you know this, you can handle most of the layouts, and we'll cover like complex layouts, and we're going to use grid for that in our application. So just FYI, this part right here, this nav bar, this is using justify content space between and align item center. I don't think I put align item center because there's like a little gap at the bottom, but generally you vertically align it center with align item center, and then justify content space between on the parent component, and then you have your layout. And that's pretty much Flexbox. All right, so from here, I'm going to change this flex basis to back to 30%, keep it like that, and we should be good to go. Now we'll add the images and all the content afterwards, and I'll go through that individually, but for now, we're just going to have like a blank gray spot for our placeholder. And we're just going to move to the final section. Aside from the footer is going to be this form right here. And we're going to talk about some, form elements, which are kind of important when it comes to styling because you often encounter a lot of these inputs and they require a lot of different styling. So right here, I'm going to put a comment, say form elements, form section with HTML elements and images. We're going to save that, go back to our index.html, and below this section, I'm going to call it HTML elements form section. Put a section like this with class is equal to element and close that up. And we're going to create another div. I'm going to call this class is going to be element underscore left, like so. Close that out. And we're going to have a div inside here. Going to say class is equal to element underscore placeholder. So it's going to be a placeholder for our images when we'll cover images very, very soon. And then over here, I'm going to have a div with a class of element underscore right. Close that out with h2 sign up today now exclamation, and we are going to have a p tag with class. So nothing too special. Make sure I have everything set up with the p tag. Class is equal to element underscore subtitle. Close this out. I'm going to say fill out the form below to sign up for our newsletter and receive updates. So we're going to have this p tag, and finally I'm going to have a form. Call this class with element underscore form. And again, this is a form element. This comes with HTML, and this is usually used for basically having your form inputs, and you encase it around all the inputs that you have. And then here I'm going to say h3 your interest colon like that. And below this, I'm going to have just like a UL tag. These are, unordered list. So that comes with bullet points. So it's not anything with a number. This is anything with like a bullet point, something like that. And we are going to say element underscore list and put this over li class is equal to element underscore list dash item. Close this out, say web development. I'm going to copy this right here, paste it 2 times, call this one UI UX design, and this one is going to be digital marketing. And let's just save it, see how it looks. So we have your interest, web development, UI UX design, so on and so forth. And then from here we have another, we're going to add some space. We're going to do class is equal to element underscore form dash group. Close that out. We're going to have a label this time for username. Make sure this is within the string, or within the string, and username like so. Now label is another HTML element. This is for inputs, and generally you want to have an input with type is equal to text, and ID is going to be is equal to username. And make sure that's within the string like this. We're also going to have a placeholder, which is a text that gets placed within the element. We're going to close this out, and we're going to have an input. So there we see a little bit input. It's very small below there. We have enter username, things like that. And generally, when you use elements like this for an input, you use a for username that gets attached to the ID of a username. So they're basically linked in the form. From here, I'm going to copy this div right here, including the class. I'm going to put it as another one. Make sure we close out that div. And then inside this div, I'm going to have another label. Copy this from here. I'm going to change this username instead to course. And we're just going to select course like this. And inside here, we're going to have a different tag, which is select. And we're going to put an ID of course. And inside here, I'm going to do option with value, empty string. We're going to do choose a course. So this is how you do a drop down. I'm going to copy and paste this 3 times. The value for the first one is going to be HTML. This one's going to be HTML and CSS. This one's being JavaScript, so we're going to do JS. This one's going to be JavaScript like this. This one's going to be React, and we are going to choose React like that. So that will be our select dropdown, and as you can see, we have our little drop-down menu, which is pretty cool with our select option. And then below this, we're going to have a button with the type is equal to submit, with the class is going to be equal to element underscore button, and we're going to do submit form. And that will give us our little button at the end. It'll refresh the page when you hit submit form, but for now, we're not going to worry about that. So we're going to save it. We basically have, I'm not exactly sure why that changed to an element, but make sure that's a text right here, submit form. So from here, we're going to go to our styles and we're going to start styling this. And there's a bit to cover, but nothing too difficult compared to everything else we've been doing. So the first thing we want to do is if we take a look at this particular thing, just like Flexbox, we have these two items next to each other. If we do this, we can see these two are flexed right next to each other. So that is what we're going to use. We're going to use a Flexbox to put our image and also our form on the right side. So we're going to start with display flex, justify dash content, colon space between. So we don't need to do align item center because there's no vertical extra height that we need to deal with. But for now, we're going to just set padding to be 100 pixel, and we're going to put a gap of 60 pixel between, and the background color is going to be F8, F9, FA, like so. So as you can see, this is like a wider background color. And we're going to use something called underscore left. For the left section, we're going to set this to be flex of 1 because we want this to be taking up half the space. And you can use some shorthand called flex colon 1 to make sure both items, we have both element on the left and the element on the right to be taking up 50%. And we can do this with flex 1 like that. So if you take a look over here, we have element left and element right. So that takes up 50%. You can also set this to be width of 50%, but I just wanted to show you that you can use flex of 1. Basically, this takes up 1 unit of space in that flex container. So since there's 2 of them, they're going to take 50%. If there's 3 of them, they're going to take 33. So it's just an alternative way, and I just wanted to show you you can do that too. So element subtitle, we're going to add some styling for that. So this is just going to be our usual with the color 5B or 5D, 5D, 5D. Give it a margin top of 10 pixel, margin bottom. And then from here, I'm going to do element underscore form with display flex. And here I'm going to use flex direction colon column and give it a gap of 20 pixel. So now we're actually using flex in a vertical direction. If you see this, before I did the flex direction, let's just remove that. I want to show you that right now everything is scrunched up to the top essentially. But when we do flex direction column, we have space vertically and we had a gap of 20 pixels. So the main axis is now vertical. So instead of it being kind of like a static set of items that are just stacked on top of each other, we are now dictating that spacing using element dash underscore form. Now let's add the element underscore placeholder. So we have our gray background. We're going to do this background dash color. Give it, let's just say gray, make our lives easier. Width of 100%, height of 100%. And that'll fill out our little box for our image just for the time being. And then from here with the list items, we don't want bullet points. We want to change that. So we're going to do element underscore list with list style dash type colon none, padding colon left colon 0. If we save it, we can see that the bullet points are gone. And then from here, I'm going to do dot element underscore list dash item. We're going to do padding of 8 pixel top and bottom, 0 left and right. Border bottom should be 1 pixel solid, E0, E0, E0 for the color. And we're going to give it a color of 5D, 5D, 5D. That will allow us to have a little bit like a border styling at the bottom. And by the way, I mentioned we had border. We can also do border bottom, which makes it very nice. And now there's something right here. We can see, let me turn off the pesticide. We have this border item with the right arrow. We can actually do that with something called the before pseudo class. Now we haven't talked about pseudo classes, but right here we can do something with the pseudo class like colon before. So we take whatever class we want to use, and we can put a colon and the colon before, so that we can basically duplicate that element. Basically, this is just a way so we can place another element or another styling on top of it. And there's also after, which is another one. So basically, you can duplicate that element in a nice little way. And this is very nice for like little effects like this. And for the content, we can have this little arrow, and we're going to do margin dash right is going to be 10 pixel. And color is 34C759. So again, if you take a look, now we have these like bullet points for the arrows. So this is a nice convenient way to kind of duplicate what we need, and we can put something next to the original item. So if you ever want to like duplicate something, you can use the before tag or the after tag, which has a very similar result. And then finally, I want to do for element underscore form dash group. So that's for both the username and the select option. Just for those, we're going to add another flex. So this is another way you can like layer from parent, child, parent, child. You can have a lot of nested flexes in between. And we're going to do for flex direction column, and we're going to do a gap of 8 pixel, like so. We're going to save that, and as you can see, this is now aligned in a different way so that they're kind of like right next to each other. So it's more aligned properly. All right, so now we want to style like the titles or the labels and also these inputs. So now we can use label and we can use input like this for the element selectors. We can select it that way. However, it is bad practice to do that because maybe you have more labels or inputs and you want to do that for different labels and you want them to have different styling for other situations. So here we can use something called group or a combination selectors. So basically this is a more specific way to target different selectors. So let's say I have element underscore form dash group, and we can do something like label like this. So if you go back to index.html and we want to select a label specifically, we are selecting both this and label. So anytime we have both element form group label, we are going to style this particular one as well as this one right here. So that is how we target more specifically our classes. And it is one of the selectors that I did not mention, but I did mention at the beginning that this is something we'll talk about later. So let's say I change this to font weight of 500. I'm going to save that. And as you can see, subtle change, but the labels, both of these, have been changed as well. So it's good practice to be as specific as possible if you're just wanting to change the color of one specific label. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this dot element form group like this because we're going to be using it. We're going to change input as well. And then there's also another way we can do combination of selectors like this, where we have a comma and we can select both of these, input and select, at the same time. So if you want to have the same set of classes for two different type of things we select, we can do something with the comma. And we are going to set this padding to be at 12 pixels, border of 1 pixel solid, and we are going to do E0, 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 border radius of 4 pixel, and we are going to make sure we inherit the font family, because sometimes with inputs and select, they're not inheriting the fonts that we wanted to use because they have their own default styling. We're going to save that. And now, as you can see, we have a better looking input and select. So these have a padding of 12 pixels, a border of 1 pixel. So that is like the little border around it. And then border radius, which will, oh, I haven't talked about border radius, but basically that will round out the corners. So it is dependent on how much pixels you have. So even if I do 200 pixels, that's going to round it out. And I'm going to make it back to 4 pixels because that's better. And we have our styling like that. So now if you click on this, you have a focus. This dark blue is kind of jarring. It's a little too much. So we're going to change that. And the way we change that specifically, we're going to copy this right here, close that out. But now we have a duplicate, but we're going to use a pseudo class once again, just like we talked about before. There is something called :focus, and this is important for HTML inputs and select. That will target the styling that we have over here. So we're going to do an outline of none with a border color of 34C759, which is similar to border, but this is border includes a shorthand for multiple properties like this, but border color is specifically just for the color. And I'm going to do a box shadow :000 2 pixel RGBA 52 199 89 and 0.2. And don't worry, this is not something I'm coming up off the top of my head. It's just what I tested out and it looked nice. And now if we click on it, we have kind of like a little green little shadow color that pops up with the border color of a slight green. Makes it very nice and much less jarring, fits it into our current style. All right, and then from here, I'm going to copy this element group select because we need to style the select separately. And I'm going to do cursor pointer. This is something I haven't talked about, but a lot of times when you're dealing with buttons and you're customizing it, when you hover over this, does not have a cursor pointer, which you want to indicate with the mouth when you hover over it. So you have this like little pointer cursor when you hover over that. And we also want to set the background color to be white for this. And then finally, I'm going to copy this, change the option tags, and we're going to set that to be padding of 8 pixel. And I'm going to go through this last part quickly. We're going to have element _ button. So we change the submit form button. Now we're going to do a background color of 34C759. Give it a color of white, padding of 12 pixel, 24 pixel, border of none, border radius of 4 pixel, cursor of pointer like I just talked about, a font weight of 500, and lastly we can do something called transition. So this is, we're going to set this to be background color of 0.2 seconds. So this is a very nice way for a UI experience. When we hover over it, the background color will change slowly from 0.2 seconds. So this is kind of like an animation thing. And we can see the button is not working because if I go back, I spelled this incorrectly for the class. So sometimes you make a mistake and you'll see now, if I save it, you'll see the submit form. So now if I hover over it, we don't see the different colors when we hover. So we need to do element _ button :hover. That is another pseudo class that we're doing, and it's one that you frequently use. And we're going to set this background color to be a lighter green color. A lot of times when you do hover, you just take this color make it like a slightly lighter color of that version. So you go like this. And if I were to change the transition to 1 second, just so you can see it happens, you can see the hover effect and the color changes is a lot slower. It's very smoother. Otherwise, it'll just automatically do it, or like it instantly changes the color and it's not as pleasing. All right, and that's it for the form section. All right, so while we finished most of the layout and the styling of the entire page, but we're still missing some images and some final elements that we are missing from our application. So we're going to start with right here. We're going to start with the background image of this. Now we haven't talked about background images, so let's talk about that first after we set up images and final styling. Now we don't need to add any elements for this because we have everything. So instead, we're going to start by marking our hero. Now, generally, you can go to the hero elements that we created earlier from class selector. We can use all of this. But for the sake of this tutorial, we want to have this in order so you can refer back if you ever need to. So we're going to go down and we're going to put our styling over here. You can have duplicate classes like this and rewrite it like having a hero, another hero over here, and this will override if you choose the same colors. Like if I choose the same property like padding, if I write padding in the bottom, it's going to override the ones in the previous. But we're just going to instead choose different properties instead, and we're going to be using those. So we're going to start with height, and what we want to use is height viewport 50%. So 50% and 50 viewport height is kind of similar, but they have different properties. Viewport height is always going to take 50% of the entire screen. So that if it's nested, when you use 50%, it's going to be height of 50% of the parent container. Remember, we talked about parent-child relationships. It's only going to take the 50% of the parent of that element. But viewport height is going to be the entire page no matter what. So it's going to take 50% of this entire page. And as you can see, this is taking up 50% of the page. And then from here, I'm going to set the background size to be cover and actually set the background image to be a URL from images/hero.jpg like that. Make sure you have a colon at the back. And now you can see we have an image for our background. Now, if you go back to our directory, you can see we have our images, and basically the URL is going to refer from where the styles sheet is. We're going to go back, grab the images, and we're going to choose hero.jpg over here. So that is our background image. Now it's kind of bright and the colors in the text is not displaying correctly. We are going to set the background position first to be center. So that will position the image upwards. So it's located in the right section. And if I just remove the background size cover, it's going to use the full image size, which is a lot larger than this page. So you only get this amount. So you want to use something like background size, which will take up the relevant space that we have here. And on top of that, we can use something called background color and do RGBA 0, 0, 0. So that's basically black color, but we're going to give it a opacity of 0.55. So this is why RGBA is very nice. And right now we don't see anything because we need to do background blend dash mode colon overlay. And that will give us a darker color. So now we can see the text a lot better. And now right now the original text color was black. So we're going to scroll up, go to hero.title, and we're going to change to be F5, F5, F5 like this. So now we have a text color that looks very nice on this darker black background. This is a very common technique for putting images on your website, which make everything look nice. But you really need to be able to visualize and see and have good contrast to see the text. And then from here, we're going to do text align center. This is an easy way to align our text in the center. And also there is some property called align content. This is a newer property that you can use to vertically align your content. If you don't want to deal with display, flex, and you don't want to deal with the Flexbox, it's just a nice way to center everything that we need. And there you go. We have our hero landing page pretty much set up. All right, and then from here, we have this section. We don't have any images here yet, so we're just going to practice Flexbox once again. If you take a look, this is our final application. We have this to be 50%, and this is 50% as well. So we want an image in that location. So we're going to go to our index.html, go to where we have features, which is section 2, go down to the bottom, and right below or right above the closing section tag, we're going to have a div. We're going to say class is going to be equal to feature underscore image dash container. So we put an image in here, and we're going to use the image tag for the first time. And we're going to say class is going to be feature underscore image. We're going to have a source, and this is the URL where the image will live. So images, and we have an image called features JPEG, like so. The alt is just going to be the text that is represented for people who cannot see the images, like accessibility. And we're going to have an image. And now as you can see, the image is placed right below it, which is a problem, and it's ginormous. So what we want to do is place it side by side. And if you look, feature is the parent container. So we want this to be side by side with the feature container. So we want to do something with flex. Now, typically, again, you would go up to the classes and change it there, but I'm going to put it over here so you can focus on this aspect because we're doing it after. So we're going to do display of flex like this, justify content with space between, and give it a gap of 20 pixel. And now it's left and right, but we still have a problem of the image being ginormous. So we're going to do feature container like so. And this time, instead of using flex of 1, we're going to use flex of basis 50%, just so you can see that we're going to get the same result as we did before when we split items side by side next to each other. So we're going to do flex basis of 50%. And we still have a problem. It's still too big because we need to set the feature image. And we need to actually set this to be width of 100%, height of 100%. And when we save it, it's going to take up the space. Now, if you take a look, it's perfect in that it takes up 50% of the width. However, it has a problem of getting stretched out. And this is a very common problem with images. And it's very tricky to get this right for responsive design, meaning it works on all screens. So you can do something like object fit cover, in that it will take up as much space as you need, and it'll just modify it based on the screen size. Now later on you'll do something with media queries, because sometimes when you look at an image like this on this type of screen, it looks it doesn't have the same pizzazz as if you have it open with Alt, 3 people visually seen. But this is a nice responsive hack that we can use for the time being. Later on we'll use media queries to make this a little better, but for now this is what we have. Now there's a couple other things that we want to fix. Just like the title is a little too font bold and the font is not correct. And if you hover over these buttons right here, these two, they're not correct. So we're going to do that quickly. We're going to do CTA underscore title like so. We're going to do font size of 24 pixel, font dash weight of 400 for the title. And then we're going to do CTA underscore button dash dash primary :hover like so. Background dash color should be D0, D0, D0. And the cursor of pointer. And that should fix right here. We can just hover over it and we can see that this text has been changed. And then over here, we're going to do dot video underscore button primary. Give it a color of 5BB471. And I'm going to copy this select tag. So we have a hover pseudo class as well. And we are going to do background color, and we are going to give it the same background color, like so, to make it look nice with the color of white for the text. So sometimes when you have hover and you want to have a pretty cool effect, you can change and invert the colors like so. And we are going to do the exact same thing, paste it over here, copy this primary, change this to secondary, so we have it for the second button. So when you hover over this, we have this pretty cool effect for both these buttons. All right, cool. And then we still need to add the image. So to do that, we're just gonna grab the video underscore container. We're just gonna select this guy right here. We're gonna set the background dash image of URL images slash video.jpg, background size of cover. Make sure you have an ending semicolon there. Background position of center, a height of 700 pixel, a background blend mode of overlay like we did before because it's a little too bright, and we're going to give it a background color of RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0.05, just like a very slight background color. And now, as you can see, we have this background image for our video. And we're not going to put the video, it's just going to be an image. And then from here, we have just these blank boxes, but these kind of need to be like a card-like item. We have an image, we have text, another text, and the button below it. So we want to add the HTML for it. So we're going to go all the way to section 5 with the programs card section. So inside these programs card, we're going to add several things. We're going to add an image. We're going to do class is equal to programs underscore card dash image with a source is going to be image is slash program 1.jpg. Alt is going to be learning activities like so. We're going to have an image like that. And then from here, I'm going to have an H3 engaging extracurricular activities for holistic student development, like so. And also inside here, we're going to have a P tag, and we're going to say our school offers modern facilities designed to enhance learning experience. I'm going to save that. We can see on ours, we have the text and the image being extremely large. We're going to fix that with our styling, but for now, we're going to copy this. Actually, we need to add one more button. So we're going to add a button with class is equal to programs underscore button, like so, and we're going to say learn more. We're going to copy this guy, or actually inside the image, and paste it in both of these programs cards. And I'm going to, if you're using Visual Studio Code, I'm going to close that one up. I'm going to close this second one up so we can see that we have a program card right here for the second one, and we're going to modify those. So program should be 2 for this. This one should be academic program. And this time I'm just going to copy this right here, diverse academic programs detail, so you can just look at that and copy it. And I'm going to paste it over here, same thing. I'm going to save that, close that up, open the third one, copy this for the title, and copy this description as well, paste it over there, and we should be good to style. So we're going to go back to style, and we're going to look at that program card. There is no background. We're going to have a padding of 0 around. Flex basis is going to be 30%, meaning width of 30% for each of these. And these are going to be flexed. So this is going to be flexed if you take a look. These are flexed from top to bottom with space in between. And we're also going to give it a height with a border radius of 8 pixels. This is what's going to be there. So we're going to do the same thing. Right now it's a little chaotic. So let's start with programs underscore card and do background of none. So we get rid of the gray background. Give it a padding of 0, flex basis of 30%, display of flex. Flex direction is going to be column. In justify, content is going to be space between. Give it a gap of 15 pixel, a height of 500 pixel, and a border radius of 8 pixel. We're going to save it. When we still have the image problem because the images need to be targeted specifically. So we're going to look at program card. We need to target the image. Now we added this class, so we can target that one. And they're all going to be the same for each one. So I'm going to do dot image like so. And we are going to set the width to be 100%. Height is going to be 700 pixel. And this is something we haven't used before, a min height of 200 pixel. So min, there's min dash height and then there's min dash width, meaning that's the minimum those cards can have in terms of their width and the content size. And the reason why you use those is sometimes when your images are too small and you have like if you're using Flex specifically, your image size can become way too small for visibility. So you want to set a minimum height sometimes so that it fits the screen properly while also maintaining the content information. And we'll talk about this more as we go through our app too. And we also want to do object fit.cover and border radius of 4 pixel. If we save that, we should see that our images are now correctly displayed. So right now, minimum height doesn't really do anything, but I'll cover that later. And then from here, I want to target programs underscore card dash description. We're just going to change the color of this. This is color going to be 6E6E. And we're going to use a font weight of 300, margin bottom of 15 pixel. And then lastly, we're going to style the button. We're going to do programs underscore button background, and make sure you spell button correctly. Background dash color is going to be 34C759 with the color of white, padding of 10 pixel from the top and bottom, 20 pixel left and right, border radius of 4 pixel, cursor is going to be pointer, and a margin top of auto. And with that, we're going to do programs underscore button, and we're going to use hover. Say background dash color is going to be 2db14e. And that should set up. And right now the button is not displaying anything because I did spell programs button incorrectly. There should be 2 underscores, and you're going to have to fix it for all of these. And just do that, and you save it. You're going to see the buttons with hover effect and everything good. All right, and so the last stretch is going to be this image. And what we're going to do is we're going to scroll back, go to this element placeholder. We're going to get rid of that. We're just going to say image like so, with class is equal to element underscore image. We're going to do source is equal to images form image.jpg. Alt is going to be form image, and we're going to close that. And again, as you can see, the image is ginormous. So we're going to go to our styles, to element underscore image. We're going to put a width of 100%, a height of 100%, object dash fit of cover, and a border radius of 8 pixel. And we have our image perfectly set up, and that should be good. All right, and that's pretty much most of our application. Now I'm going to leave it up to you for a little exercise. You can style this nav bar. I'll put it in the link in the description. There's going to be a completed app. You can test it out. You can see that the app 1 should have the nav bar and also the footer as well. So you can test out your skills with building these out yourself. All right, so we have our application fully built. So now what we can do is deploy this application, and we're going to deploy this application on Hostinger that we set up a long time ago. So let's go to Hostinger. We're going to go to File Manager. It's going to take you to this page. We're going to go into public_HTML. We're going to delete this. And for the app, so what we want to do is for app 1, we want to drag this into the file manager. So let's do just that. So we're going to drag it over here, and we should be able to see images, index, and our style sheet. So we're going to go back. We're going to go back to our dashboard, and we're going to hit this link right here. And with that, we should be able to see our website instantly. This is how easy it is to create an application, host it on Hostinger, and just allow everyone to see. All right, so our second application is going to be this news application right here, as you can see. Now, this application is specifically focused on grid and flex and how to set up layouts. I'm going to have a step-by-step process on how you can go through figuring out what to decide when to use grid versus Flexbox versus absolute and relative positioning. This is one of the most important parts of understanding CSS, and a lot of people overlook this aspect of CSS. And I really want to teach you how to do this in practice. Now, I have another video about CSS. It's called The Only CSS Layout That You'll Ever Need, where I talk about what to use and when to use. But this is where we're actually building a small little application showing you different scenarios and edge cases of how to use each one in very much detail. We're going to go through very complex grid layouts and some minor Flexbox layouts as well. So I'm going to show you this little flowchart that we have here. So the first thing you want to do in determining a layout type is going to be a 2D layout. What that means is if we see something that has something like maybe two layers, it goes X and also has a Y component. When you have a situation like this or this where it includes both an X direction and a Y direction, so maybe there's more than one row essentially. So if you see something like this, you can use Flex, but if it gets to a point like this is now two-dimensional. So that is a deciding factor of when you should use which one. So if you do use 2D layouts, you're most likely going to use grid. And if it's very complex, we're going to talk about it. We're going to use grid template areas. Otherwise, if we're not doing a 2D layout, we're going to use a 1D layout if it is one-dimensional and not just a single item. We're going to check if it's an overlay or eccentric, and I'll talk about what that means. That is when you use absolute versus relative. Now, please note, I haven't talked about absolute or relative positioning just yet in this entire application. Now, a lot of people probably learn about this pretty early on, and they start positioning different items all throughout the screens using absolute relative. And I'm going to tell you why you should not do that. And instead focus on Flexbox. So Flexbox is going to be your go-to first option for one-dimensional layouts. So we are going to start with just that. And we are going to start by creating this particular nav bar, which is pretty simple. So I'm going to squeeze that all the way down and go to our second application. So remember, we have the assets downloaded. We're going to go to index and styles. So in this case, I had the HTML already written. So we're going to skip the writing of HTML because it's pretty redundant. Now you understand how to do the HTML. So right now, this is all the HTML, but this has no CSS applied to it. So we're going to open up both the index and the styles, and we're going to start from here. Now for now, I put this as temporary. After we add our styles, we're going to remove this image, which is 100 pixel height of 1 pixel. And here we just have a number of base styles. This is generally what you want to set from the beginning and applies to everywhere. So we're not going to deal with that. So the first thing we want to handle is our Flexbox. So if you remember correctly, Flexbox, when we have something like this, it makes it a little invisible right here. Right here, we have two different boxes over here. So this is going to be a Flexbox, and we're going to have two items, and this is going to be justified between. You're going to use justify content, set space between, and we're also going to have another set right here. This is also going to be space between. So let's get started with that. So I'm going to move this down to styles so we can see both our HTML and CSS. And we are first going to target our header HTML. So I'm going to write dot header, put background of 1D, 1D, 1D with a padding of 1.5 rem, so top and bottom, and 0 for left and right. And we are also going to set the color to be FFF like this. I'm going to save it, look at our application, and we have our background. So the colors are a little messed up right now, so let's go and fix that. We're going to do header logo. So that is going to be the today text. So we're going to say font size is going to be 1.5 rem, and note that this time we're not using pixels, and we're using font weight of, instead of a number like 800, we're just going to use bold. So you can use bold, normal, thin, like that, or you can use the number notation. Either one's fine. And I believe bold is 800 or 700, one of those numbers. And then over here we have header nav is going to be display to be flex. So header nav is the container containing header logo and header links. We're going to set this to be justify content with space between. So now, as you can see, we have a little hard to see, but we have our nav links, the blues over here, and then we also have our today logo. So that is exactly what we want. And then we also want to vertically align them in the center. And like I said, this is the most common type. You can see that this was moved down a little bit, so it's aligned directly in the center of today. And then we're also going to set the max width so that the maximum width this can ever be is 1500 pixel. And right now you can't see that, but it happens on bigger screens. So if I go, now if you see it on bigger screens like this, you can see that it's not going all the way over here. That happens when you have larger screens and you set the max width. That's the maximum width it will ever be. But if it's smaller than that, it can size down to less than 1500 pixels. And then from here, we're going to do a padding of 0 from the top and bottom and 4 rem left and right. So that will be a padding, so it's not hugging the left and right, which is not pleasant. And then we're also going to do margin 0 auto. Now, I haven't not covered this, but this basically centers our left and right margin. Anytime you want to center something, you can also use margin 0 auto. You can use flex justify content center, which is more annoying, but margin 0 auto is another way, a plethora of amount of ways that we can center things. We can also use text align center, but that's not ideal for a lot of situations. So margin 0 auto is another option. And then if you take a look at this, these are kind of hugging each other. So we want to flexbox these guys as well for the nav links. So going to the header links over here, we're going to do header dash links, and we can do display colon flex, justify content, space between, you know the drill. Align items is not really going to do anything, but we can just do it for the sake of it. And we can do a gap of 2 rem to put space in between. And there we go. We have space that we want like that, but we also want to change the colors of the links. So we can do something like this with another combination selector. So we do header links, and within header links, we are going to put a space between A so we can target header links and the A element like so. So then we can set the color to be FFF with text decoration of none. So now if we take a look, we have all of these. Now the only thing is the hover is not there, so we want to do something like this. Header dash links, and then a colon hover, which is a pseudo class. And we are going to set that to be color, a gray color, so 9C, 9C, 9C. So we go like that, and our links should be basically working. We should also set the cursor to pointer, otherwise it's kind of messed up. And you want to put the cursor pointer to be on A, because there's some weird elements where it, like there's a link, but you want to put it on the actual A link instead. So pretty straightforward. This navbar is something we've already done, but it's good to have a lot of practice to understand that how common Flexbox is going to be. And again, this is one dimensional. So one dimensional, it has one single direction. There's no multiple rows. So this is perfect ideal scenario. The next thing is still going to be Flexbox. We're going to use Flexbox. We're going to use Flexbox horizontally and then vertically as well. So remember, we did flex direction columns, and this is a perfect use case for flex direction. So we're going to go to our second section over here with flex column featured article. And I'm going to put a class called featured. And we are going to do display colon flex. And by the way, I added this in post. Right here, we have a doc container. You'll have this in your code base already when you download the assets. This should already be there. I just added this. I forgot to add it for this particular one. So make sure you have that. This is a container tag that we just apply. It'll make our lives easier when we handle other things. So we're going to scroll back down to the dot featured section. And like we did display flex so that this image is aligned with this particular text. So instead, I want to do justify dash content, which is going to be space dash between. And we are going to do align dash items colon center. So we center everything. And then we're also going to do gap is going to be 2 rem with the margin of 0 and a height of 600 pixel. So that will align everything that we want for our featured from left to right. But this right here on the right side is not correct. But before that, we're going to remove this temporary thing right here. The width and the height of all our images is going to mess up and it looks a little crazy. And so we want to go back to our dot featured and we're going to modify a few things. So we have a featured image. So we want to make that 50% along with the featured content. So I'm going to do featured dash image, set that to flex basis of 50%. So it takes up half the width, a height of 100%, a background color of E0, 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 a border radius of 8 pixel. So now you'll notice it's not going to modify anything. We still have the same problem. So we want to do featured dash image, and then we're going to target the image tag that we created, image element. We're going to set that to be width 100%, so it's constrained. Same thing as the height to be 100%, and we are going to set object dash fit to be cover. Once we have that, we're going to have an image that's kind of cut off, but it is not taking 50%, and that's because we did not constrain the right side as well. So to do that, we are going to target the featured content element over here. And we're going to set flex basis to be 50% with the display of flex, because we want this text to be spread out evenly, and we want it to hug the top and the bottom of the image size. So we are going to set the height to be 100%, so it takes up the entire height, but also do flex direction to be column, so the main axis is up and down. And then we're going to do justify content to be, we can try space between, so I can show you how it looks like. And we are going to do a gap of 1 rem, which in this case, it won't matter. But there you go. We have this. If you take a look over here in our tag, we have the H2 at the top, P tag in the middle, and the featured footer at the bottom over here. So this is how you set the elements and display for something like this. But this is kind of too much space. It doesn't look that great. So we're going to change the justify content to be center so that there is a gap, but it's much more manageable and does not look that bad. And then from here, we want to target the button. So we're going to modify that. We're going to say dot featured dash more. We're going to give it a color of FFF with the background of 1D, 1D, 1D. Make sure you have a hashtag. And then we're going to set the padding to be 1 rem, top and bottom, 2 rem, left and right, border radius of 5 pixel, and a border of none. We also want to add a hover pseudo class. And we have background of 414141 with the color of D9, D8, D8, and a cursor of pointer. So we'll have a little hover effect for that. And we want to change the featured dash footer to be display of flex so that there is some space. We're going to do a gap of 1 rem so that we have space between the read more and 2-minute read. And we're going to do align dash items colon center with the margin dash top of 2 rem. And finally, we're going to change the color of the content, which is like the description in the middle with featured content P. We're going to do color 40, 40, 40. Change the color just a slight tad. And there you go. This is pretty easy. One-dimensional layout for Flexbox. And you can layer the Flexbox into multiple sections. And remember, everything is based on different boxes. We have a box here. We have another box here. Another box over here. Same with both of these. This is a box. And then you have another box here with Flex. So you can have a lot of different layers for your layout. Now, I did want to mention why I use Flexbox. There used to be something called float. Now, I recommend float. Used to be the old way of positioning things. It was a huge pain when you had to do it. So nowadays, never use float. It is something I would consider deprecated. You should probably never ever use it. So don't do that. Just use Flexbox when you have the chance. All right, so from here, we're going to do a little bit of Flexbox as well, but this time we're going to have these rows that are happening over here. When it's on a wider screen, you can see it all fits on one row, but if it's on a smaller screen, it's going to wrap around. And we're going to do this both with Flexbox and what we are going to introduce Grid as a alternative and, in my opinion, better option for something like this. Now note, I put a lot of US election dummy data just to emotionally trigger you guys. So it takes the edge off Flex and Grid. So let's get started. So we're going to get to Flex, Grid, and List. So we're going to go to our HTML and see that the section is called Latest. So we're going to start by labeling that latest like so. We're going to give it a padding of 6 rem from top to bottom. Give it a background of F5, F5, F5. It doesn't really do anything because we'll have images, but just in case, we can see the colors. So right now, we're just going to see this text over here, and we're going to see the images as well as the text over here. That is what's being shown. And so what we want to start by doing is changing this latest title. So we're going to do latest dash title with margin dash bottom colon 1 rem. And we're going to change the subtitle as well. We're going to do dot latest dash subtitle. And we're going to do margin dash bottom colon 2 rem with the color of 666, 666, like so. and I'll change this color and give it a little margin bottom from the subtitle. And to start off, we're going to look at the latest list right here. So let me open this up so you guys can see better. We have a number of cards. Each card is going to include this image, the title, the description, and the button as well. So that is right here, all three of those. So we are going to fold this up so you can see this a little better to understand what we are dealing with. So we have this latest list as the parent and the latest card as the child. So we are going to first start off doing what we have been doing with the latest list, and we are going to set the display to be flex justify dash content with space between, and we are going to give it with a gap of 2 rem. And as of right now, you can see it doesn't wrap. Right now, it's going to just extend all the way left and right. We can see that there is cards for every single one, and it's kind of a little crazy. So before we do anything else, what we're going to do is style the card so it doesn't have that craziness. So we're going to give it a width of 100%, a height of 500 pixel. So we have a little bit more constraint to it. We're going to give it a border radius of 8 pixels. So we have rounded corners with the box shadow of none and a background of a white color. And we're going to say overflow : hidden. Now, I've never talked about overflow hidden, but it is a nice way to hide things that may overflow a container. So in these images are ginormous, so they're just going to hide everything that it cannot fit. So we can only see parts of the image now, nor can we see the text below. So let's actually change this up. Make sure the image is not ginormous. So we can do latest card, and we are going to target this image right there. So I'm going to do width of 100%, a height of 250 pixel, and an object dash fit of cover. So now, using this, we have a specific size height for the images, and we are using object fit cover just to cover the image so that it is responsive as we change the size. And let's fix a few things. We're just going to change the latest dash content, giving a padding of 1.5 rem. Change the dot latest dash content with h3 with a margin dash bottom of 1 rem. And we are going to continue adding some more, and we're going to target the p tag as well. We're going to give it a color of 666 and a margin dash bottom of 1.5 rem. And the button is going to be latest dash more with text decoration of none. So we don't have any text decoration for that. Give it a font weight of bold, padding of right 1.5 rem. So we have that fixed a little bit. So the problem here is it gets really small when you're zoomed in. It's fine over here when we have a lot of space, but when we get to a point where it's too close, you're gonna miss out some text right here. Now we can extend the height of it, but it would be better if they wrap around on the next line. So that is where flex wrap : wrap comes in. And now when you do that, we just have all the entire card's width of 100%, which is not exactly what we want. We want a specific width for our card. So we can just set this, let's say 300 pixel. And you can see now that it does wrap. It does wrap, and it has something that goes on the next line. So if you look at this, we have 300 pixels. That is the pixel width that you have for each item. And the problem is sometimes when you have like a screen size like this, there's like a huge gap, and looks pretty much like an eyesore. So we're just going to set min width to 300 pixel so that it's going to have a minimum width of a certain amount. And if we set width as well, 400 pixels, we can kind of fix the issue that we have as well, but it's still not ideal. Especially when you have 5 elements like this. You do space between. This last one is spaced between and feels like there should be an element. Instead, it should be wrapped around to the left side. And then you might think, oh, I can try and do flex start like this. But then now when you have, it looks fine here, but when you go over here, there's this empty spot on the right side, which doesn't look great either. So now there are ways to handle this in Flex, but I realized there's a much better option, and we can use something called grid. That's where we would say, hey, we have a 2D layout. Why not just go straight to grid? And we're going to be using grid templates. So let's go to a grid cheat sheet, which I find very useful. And this page is grid.malvin. It's a link in the description. You can see this. But this is very useful to how we display the grids. Grid is a much more useful way to do 2-dimensional grids, and especially for complex layouts. What we want to look at is display grid. You can choose any one of these, but I would suggest just using grid majority of the time. And we are going to use grid template to define the number of rows and columns of the grid. Now, before we talk about grid template, let's talk about the normal things, which is justify items, which is not something you use too often, but we do use align items, just like we did before with Flexbox. There's nothing too different. We have start, end, and center. Basically, if we have multiple rows, we are setting it to the start or end or center. Justify content is very similar. We have all our items, and we can do space between, space evenly, around, just as you expect. And having some cheat sheet like this makes it look very nice to visually see what you're going to use. Align content is similar. We're just setting the elements along the column axis. And grid autoflow is something we'll take care of, or we'll look at later. But this one, grid template, is going to be the most important one. This is going to identify. So unlike Flex, where we just set on the parent container and we just identify each item, we need to set the number of rows and columns of the grid. And you do this beforehand. So if I zoom in a little bit, we can see grid template columns. We have 12 pixel, 12 pixel, 12 pixel. So you can specifically identify how wide each column is. And in this case, you had 3 columns. You can have more than 3 columns. You can have 20 columns, you can have 5 columns, you can have 1 column. You can also use a syntax called repeat, which is something we'll be using. And that's just essentially if the columns are of the same width, you would identify by using repeat instead. And then there's also ways to have different sized columns. Generally, I don't make the columns different sized. I generally stick to from 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, or 12 columns. And rows will be depending on the layout. So we're going to go with this, with the grid template columns and grid template rows. So I'm going to go back to our code, or to our application, and we're going to make sure we're going to comment this out instead and try for a better option. So we're going to say latest dash list. We're going to say display :grid, and we're going to set grid template columns. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do repeat auto dash fit min max 200 pixel and 1 FR. Now this is a little crazy. Okay, this is a little crazy. This columns is basically setting a property called auto fit. Generally, we can do like 3, that means 3 columns, but we're using something called AutoFit, which is determining the number of columns automatically based on this is supposedly the width. Now, generally, you have something like 300 pixel. That means it'll try to fit as many columns that will exist on the screen for 300 pixels. But there's something better than that, is generally when you have something like a grid, you want to set a minimum width of each column. So each column has to be at least 200 pixels and at max 1 fractional unit. Now this 1 fractional unit is like what we saw with Flex:1. That means it'll try to take 1 fractional unit per column at most. And if that's not retrieved, if it's less than 200 pixels, meaning there's 600 pixels wide of a screen, that means it's going to go on to the next line. So let's actually change the min width and the width as well. We're going to change it back to width of 100%. And let's actually see what's going to happen. Right now, we see that we have a column of 5 right here, or not a column of 5, we have a column of 3 right next to each other. And there's a minimum of 200 pixel, but when we keep going closer and closer, it's going to shrink down, which is perfect, exactly what we would expect, or what we would want in this case. We can continually see that it is adjusting automatically depending on the screen size. Now this property is exactly why I recommend grid, because it makes responsive design a lot easier. We also want to do a gap of 2 rem, so there's space between them. And we're just going to do a margin 0 auto. I don't think this really does anything, but just to make sure we are centered, we have this layout. So this is exactly what we're looking for. And note that even with 5 items, this is aligned together on the bottom. So this is perfect for our use case. So that means anytime it goes less, when we have like this part where it goes from 4 to 3, that means 4 columns of 200 pixels has been, the threshold has been reached to a point where it needs to now flip on to the next line. Same with over here and same with over here. That's exactly what is happening. 1 fractional unit is the max, 200 pixels is the minimum. And by doing these 2 lines, you have automatically set what you need for the latest card to happen. We don't even need width of 100% because these are, I made a mistake. You don't even need a width of 100% because it's already being calculated via grid template columns. So this is perfectly good for even a simple layout like this. Now I do want to make you pay attention to something called autofill. So in a situation like this, there's a point where if it moves beyond the maximum 1 fractional unit, you're going to be left with this space. That is the difference between autofill versus autofit. Autofit, if you just keep expanding this, it's going to try and expand as much as it possibly can. Whereas autofill, there is a certain maximum point where it's just going to have some space. So in my opinion, autofit is just more useful. Autofill might have its uses in some cases. It just depends on your use case. And with that, we have this grid all set up. Even for responsive design, you don't have to do anything with this. This is perfect because it's going to automatically deal with responsiveness. And responsive design is something that always takes a long time, and you want to reduce the headaches that come with it. And we'll cover a little bit of responsive design at the end of this application. And there you go. That is our intro to grid. All right, so our next section looks something like this. Now, in this case, this is a pretty simple standard layout where you just have a list of kind of like a little gallery of items. This is pretty relatively simple. But when you have something like this becomes a little bit trickier and a little bit different. Now, you can see how this is laid out. In this case, we have 4 different items, and there's actually, you can use Flex for this. This is, I wouldn't say if you used Flex in this case, it is wrong. However, I realized after writing the code multiple times for a design like this, grid is still a lot cleaner than trying to do something Flex for this. You can use Flex, and I don't think it's wrong to do so, but I highly recommend grid anytime, as I mentioned over here. Anytime you have a 2D layout, I would recommend using grid. It is also a lot easier to do responsive design, in my opinion, so it is good to be able to use grid as much as possible. All right, so let's go back to our version of the application where it's not styled just yet. And you can see I have 2 different versions because I really want to show you guys the difference here. So we have a section called Hot News. We're going to give this the Flex version. We also have a grid version. I'll show you that this will end up with the exact same layout and styling, but the HTML is different for both of them. So in this case, unlike before, we actually have to change the HTML structure for us to use Flex in this case. So we have both the container, we have the title, subtitle, and then we have a Flexbox over here. But this is where it gets a little complicated. We have a hot card, hot left, so that represents this huge one. We have an image, breaking news. This is perfectly fine. We're going to ignore the overlays right now because I want to just go through the entire application without talking about that because that's for absolute relative. But for now, we can look at this is the hot left side and this is the hot right side. So that represents all of this part right here, like the entire right section. And then there is this section, hot right inner, that's going to represent these 2 cards right here. That needs to be flexed. So we have a hot card and another hot card like so, side by side. And then finally, the bottom one is going to be hot card at the bottom. And that's just placed on top. Now, if you take a look at this, this is kind of a pain. Look at, it's hard to understand that this element tag is like this. It's fine to write the code, but when you come back to maintain it, this becomes kind of tricky to reason about because it's kind of all over the place and things are layered on top of each other. And having too many nested elements is never a good thing. So let's go to our CSS. And we should start by fixing our hot code. So we're going to say background is going to be 1D, 1D, 1D. So that's just going to be the entire section in the background. And let's go to our code. So everything in the back is now black, whereas the front should be FFF. So that's the text color. We're going to also do hot title margin bottom :1 rem dot hot subtitle, and we're going to do margin dash bottom, and we're going to do 2 rem. Give it a color of 666, so kind of a gray color, and we can see we have those 2 colors. So to start off, we're going to start styling our hot flex. So this is for the hot flex section. Hot flex display flex with a gap of 1 rem with the height of 600 pixel, width of 100%. And as of right now, the image is quite unbearable because of the large size. So let's actually fix that. We're going to say .hot dash card. We're going to give it a background color of E0, 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 border radius of 8 pixel, overflow of hidden. And we're also going to change .hot dash card, and we're going to target the images underneath. So every single one, by the way, has a hot card for each card article, and we have an image underneath. So that's how we target those. So we're going to have an image tag, and we're going to give it a width of 100 pixel, or 100%, a height of 100%, and object dash fit : cover. And now the images are more manageable, but we're still missing a few things. So we're going to go down to our hot flex, and we are going to start by modifying hot left, so the left side. So we're going to set this to be flex. Now this is a shorthand, 0, 0, 50%. We want to make sure this is a flex grow option, flex shrink option, and this is flex basis. So that means we're not going to let it grow or we're not going to let it shrink. So it's just going to be its kind of own behavior. And 50% it's flex basis, so that's 50% width essentially, and we are taking up 50% of the width, which is exactly what we want. We're also going to set the border radius to be 8 pixel, with overflow to be hidden. And then from here, we're going to handle the right side. So we're going to have the same exact thing. Again, we could have probably just done flex basis 50%, but I just wanted to show you something different this time. And this time I'm going to do display of flex, and we're going to do flex direction : column, so that we can see that it's going to take up, it's going to direct the flex direction vertically instead. And as you can see, we have something like this, but it's a little bit cut off, right? The last one's cut off, and we're going to fix that. So we're going to do gap of 1 rem first. So there is some space between each item. So hot right is going to represent this part right here. So we're flexing these two items. So this is what we just flexed. These two items to be, up and down with a gap of 1 rem vertically between these two. All right, and then from here, we're going to do hot dash right dash inner. We're going to set this to be a display of flex with a gap of 1 rem and a height of 50%. So now we can see we are starting to get more of what we expect. We have these two items flexed left or right of each other for the hot right item. So basically these two cards are next to right to each other. And then we also have the bottom hot card at the bottom. All right, and that's pretty much how we do this flex. Now, as you can see, it's a little hard to reason because we have a lot of nesting going on, and we have to handle like different div elements, and it's kind of a little bit scattered. Personally, I do not like the way this is because of the flex. It just makes it a little bit confusing, but grid makes this a lot easier in my opinion. So instead, let's look at our HTML tag. We're going to comment this entire thing out, and we're going to go down to 4b, uncomment this, and you'll see that the HTML is a lot more straightforward. So everything here is going to be the same, except that we have this hot grid instead. And these are all on the same level like so. We just have one layer of 4 cards like this, and we just specify each one hot grid 1, 2, 3, 4. So they have a separate element like so. So now we've already set up the cards or the flex for those, and let's take a gander at this. So we're going to call this hot grid, do a display of grid like so. And let's save this so we can see what we have currently. So right now we just have a list of images like so. Not what we want, but we can use grid template columns. And we can just do something simple for this one. We can do a repeat of 4 and 1 fractional unit. So that means we have 4 columns, and each item, each column, is going to take a maximum of 1 fractional unit space. So it's always going to be an equal amount for each item. So 25% always. So that's not all. We also need another set of rows. So we're going to do repeat to 1 fractional unit. And we're going to split this into 2 rows. Now, nothing has changed, but it did kind of give it more space. So let's go back to our completed application. We'll be able to see that we can split this grid right here, this layout, into 4 columns and 2 rows. Because if you take a look, the smallest unit that we can create from this is going to be this right here. You see this economy? This one can be 1 column. This is another column. And this right here is going to be 2 columns for that. And then there's also going to be 2 rows because this is going to take 1 row right here and another row for this. So this one is going to take 2 rows. Whereas this one is going to take 1 row but 2 columns. So it's all about trying to find the smallest unit, which is 1 column out of 4, and then 2 rows or 1 row out of 2 rows. So that's how you identify how many columns and rows you basically want. So over here, we're going to move this over so we have more space. We're also going to add a gap of 1 rem and a height of 600 pixel. When you use grid, you want to have like a set height so we can identify specifically how tall it should be. And from here, we're going to do hot-grid-1, give it a grid column of span 2. So that represents this one right here. We want this to be 2 columns like we mentioned, and we also want it to have 2 rows like we mentioned, and we can use something called span. So there we go. We have span 2 and span 2. Now that is one way of doing this. There's another notation that you can do. We can do something like 1/3 to give us the same exact result. If I just wanted to do 1 column, it would be a 1/2. If I wanted to do 2 columns, 1/3. But this can be the starting point, and this is the end point. So if I wanted to place this at the end, let's say 3/5, it's going to move it over there. So it really depends on where you want to place it. We're going to keep it to span 2. Personally, I like using span. The only thing is you just can't identify specifically where it starts, but in this case, it makes it easy. Then we're going to do hot grid-2. We're going to set the grid column for this one. It's going to be this guy. We're going to set this to span 1, grid-row to be span 1 as well. And it's already set it like that by default, but we're just going to explicitly identify it just for your sake. And the same thing with 3. And by the way it knows that it's coming from grid 2, grid 3, where it's supposed to start, it's always going to be starting from the top element, and it's going to be from the top left. So even these are already taken. So when you hit span 1, it's going to start from the top left, and it's going to do a hot grid 3, top left to bottom right. And that's where hot grid 3 is going, or grid 4 is going to start from here. And as you can guess, that's going to be hot grid 4 with grid column to be span of 2, and grid row should be span of 1. And there you go. The grid makes just a lot more sense in my opinion. You can identify the grid, create it, and it should be way easier than all the nested elements that you'll have to deal with when you're dealing with HTML. So with this, we have our layout. By the way, when you look at the final application, we have this little text right at the bottom. We're going to ignore that for now. And we're going to go on to the next section. So if you go to the final application, it's going to look something like this. So now this is getting a lot more complicated. If you were to do Flex for something like this, this would be a major headache to deal with. This is a specific use case that grid is probably much more recommended. So let's start off by looking at our HTML tag. So if you take a look, as you can see with the grid, it is so simple. You just have a bunch of different divs with different images. We just set each one with item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This makes it a lot easier to manage and a lot easier to see at a glance what it's supposed to look like. So let's get started with that. So inside here, I'm going to set the masonry to be padding of 4 rem, 1 rem for left and right, with a background of pure white in this case. And then we're going to have a masonry dash subtitle with margin dash bottom with 2 rem and a color of 666. Pretty standard. And from here, we can see we can move on to the masonry grid like so. Let's move this up a little bit, get some more space. And similar to before, we're going to do a display grid. And for us to set up the grid template columns and grid template rows, we're going to go back and look at this. So if we take a look, there's different ways to set this up, but we want to find the smallest amount of columns and smallest amount of rows that we can essentially split this page up. So you can take a look that these are probably the smallest unit column. So this part right here, these two are going to be part of the same column. And then this one is going to be its own column. So 1, 2. And then this one is not just one column. This should be 2 columns instead. And this is another column. So overall, we have 5 columns split here together. Pretty simple. And for the rows are a lot more simplistic. We just have 3 rows like this. These take up 2 rows. Everything else is going to take up 1 row. So when you have a grid like this, you can set up the number of columns and rows in a very structured and managed way of doing so. So we're going to start with grid template columns with repeat 5 and 1 fractional unit. So that splits everything evenly. And over here, we're going to set grid template dash rows. We're going to set repeat with 3 and 200 pixel like so. So here, this time I'm setting 200 pixel explicitly because we want the height to be explicit. Generally, the accepted use case is that when you're dealing with width, you want to do percentages. When you're dealing with height, you do explicit absolute units of measurements. That's generally the case. Sometimes you want to just use full height, but aside from that, generally you have specified absolute units of measurement for height. We're going to give it a gap of 1 rem. Right now, nothing is going to be shown because we still need to modify each item. So we're going to do a max width of none, just in case. Margin of 0 auto. So I don't think those actually do anything. I think I just wrote those accidentally. And then we have masonry dash item. We're going to set the background just in case to be a color of E0, 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 border radius of 8 pixel. And then from here, we have all these classes, item 1 all the way to item 7. So we're going to do this, item 1 like so. We're going to set the grid column for this one to be 1/2. Grid row to be 1/3. And right now, it's not actually doing anything because we also need to set the masonry dash item image as well. We're going to set the width to be 100%, height to be 100%. We're going to use object dash fit for cover. As you can see, I pretty much use a lot of the same thing. And if I ever need any more detailed modifications, then I change the CSS later. So from there, we can see, let's actually comment this out so you can see what it originally looked like. It's just a list of 7 items on 5 column rows and 2 rows as well. 5 column and 2 rows. And then if we were to change this, this is going to take 1 column width and 2 grid rows. So we're going to leave it like that. You can do span 1 for a grid column and span 2 for grid row for same effect. And if you take a look, this is exactly what we want. this is going to be 2 columns, 2 rows. So item 2 is going to be grid column colon 2/4 grid row colon 1/3. Pretty simple. And let's just copy this. I'm going to copy it multiple times because I just want to be able to just switch this to item 3. We can change this to 4, 5, and 1/2. So that's just going to be 1 right here for item 3. Item 4, we can just say 5 and 6, and then 1/2. No change because it's just 1 column, 1 row. For item 5, we're going to set 4 and 6 because it's going to take 2 columns. And this one's going to just be 1/2 for the row. Actually, my mistake. It's going to be 2/3 because it needs to be right here. And then item 6 is just going to be item grid column. We can do something like this, 1/span 4. This is another way you can identify the starting point, whereas the row needs to be span of 1. So that's how it starts from here. It's just an alternative way. I'm just showing you multiple ways to do it because you might see it written differently, but they all have the same effect. And for here, I'm just going to write span of 1 for the last one. All right, so it's a little bit tedious when you have to write all of this, but it's pretty simple for the understanding, and it's easy to maintain once you understand how this. And as you can see, this is pretty nice, and we have everything in the location. So as of right now, this is not, it is responsive, but when you get to this is like too thin for this. And I'll come back to media queries and I'll show you why grid makes it so easy to handle something like this. If you set this up, it is so easy to. All right, so we handled a pretty sizable grid, and we can still go to the grid template, which is grid template columns and rows that we've been talking about. But sometimes you're going to have to use something called grid template areas. So this is for very complex grids. And in general, if you take a look at our previous one, there's still a structure to this. There's rows. At most, there's like different heights and different widths of different columns. But when you get to something like this, where things span in different locations, there's a lot of variance in terms of width, there's a height and things like that. This becomes very hard to manage even with this structure. Even with this setup, it'll become very hard to manage. That's where grid template areas comes into play. Now, if we go back, we've already handled grid templates, and this cheat sheet doesn't cover one thing I wish it actually did, was grid template areas. It doesn't seem to be present over here, but this is a custom way of handling. It's a custom way of handling different elements on the layout. So you can write out header, sidebar, main, so it determines, you can call a specific element by a specific name and show you the grid template areas. So header, that represents these two top, sidebar, main is going to be the bottom two. And you can use this for very custom type layouts. And it's better if I just show you. So let's go to this. This is what we're trying to create. So this is a very complex layout, and we have a lot of images. And let's go to our HTML. We have our H2 and our paragraph tag like usual. And then we have our gallery grid, and there's a lot of items in this one. So to do this, we're going to go down to News Gallery. I'm going to set this to be gallery like so. Give it a padding of 4 rem, 1 rem like this. Let's actually go to our code just so we can see the changes that we make. And I'm going to go up here to the masonry subtitle, paste it over here, call this gallery subtitle. And we're going to change this, have another for title, pretty straightforward. We've been doing this multiple times. And we're going to have that saved. And we have our news gallery. And we're also going to go up to the masonry item images. So we're going to copy over these two elements, paste it over here, call this, gallery. So these should be gallery instead. And as you can see, we have our items like this. Right now, it's not doing exactly what we want, but this is the start of our grid items. And we're also going to change the font size to be 24 pixel. And this is something we'll do later. And we're just going to change the color to be 666. All right. So with that, we can now set up the gallery grid. So we're going to set gallery grid. So that is our parent container of our grid up here. And we are going to start with setting this display to be grid. We're going to set grid template columns. And this one, we still have to identify our columns and rows like we did before. So let's take a look once again. If you can take a look, this has 5 columns. It makes sense to split this into 5 columns. And also the rows is also 5 columns as well. So we want a 5 by 5 grid. We're going to do repeat 5, 1 fractional unit for columns, grid template rows, repeat 5 and 150 pixel for the height. We're going to do a gap of 1 rem. Let's save it. And as you can see, we have a little bit of our grid. It is not exactly what we want right now, but we're going to fix that as well. We're also going to set the max width to be none, margin of 0 auto, and we are going to specify something called grid template areas. We're going to leave this blank. We're just going to have an empty string, but this is exactly where we are going to set this up. So the first order of business, I'm going to put .a, and this class is something I specified for each. I put a very short letter for these classes because it makes it easy. You can have it longer, you just have to type more, but I put in alphabetical order for every single one of these items. And that's what we're going to be using for identifying each item in the class. So the first one, we are going to do grid dash area colon A. So with that, let's say I put inside here A for 5 columns. So that means this particular class, this gallery item, took up the entire width of the first row. And if I do the same thing, let's actually put this on a separate line. And if I do another set like so, it's going to take up 2 rows. So now you can kind of see the whole point of this is that we are identifying the location of the grid area on where it's supposed to be. And you can easily visualize. This is the big advantage, is that you can easily visualize of where things are supposed to go. You do need to align yourself with the columns and rows you have. If you put another one, it's going to mess up. So if you put like 6 columns for A's, it's going to mess up like that. So you want to make sure it is correct. And then we're going to do the same thing with .b. We're going to say grid area colon B. But let's actually start changing this. This is going to be B like this. And if you do something like this where the image does not match, it's going to mess up and not let you do it. So let's start with just B on the top to make sense. So we have this image like this right here. All right. And then from here, we can just continue doing what we're supposed to do. I'm going to have C for that. I'm going to save it. And let me just continue putting it up to G. Let's change this up. This one should be D. This one should be E. This one should be F. This one should be G. I'm going to change this to be A C, D. This one should be E, E, F, C, G. And as you can see, we've already have a pretty sophisticated layout. The first image is going to be here. Second image is here. Third image is going to take up 2 height. This one's going to be the last one. This is 2 over here. F is going to be over here. And G is going to be in this one. So by doing this, this makes our life pretty easy because we can actually visualize the areas in which it's taken, and it's very good for maintenance. Like, there's elements of just writing CSS code that makes it, you can just do it on the spot. And sometimes it's easier to do that, but a lot of times you want to make the code easy to come back to. And this is one of those things that makes it easy to come back to. So you want to always make into consideration that there is an issue later on to maintain it. And this is a huge issue, especially when it comes to AI. AI is just going to put a bunch of code. If it works for you, you're going to be like, oh, that's okay. But later on, when you come back to that code, you're going to have a lot of issues. So here I am. I'm just going to continue doing everything. I'm going to go and just copy this just to spare you the pain of me writing all of this. It's going to go all the way from A to N. I'm going to go back up over here and start writing this out. E, E, H, H, M. So I've already had this listed out, but you can just copy what I'm doing because there is a specific layout that I am adding. So we're just going to make sure we do that. And this is going to be J, K, L, and N. And when we save it, we should have the layout that we're looking for. And as you can see, this clearly maps out to the correct location. We have E with the wonderful man with Cheetos and dollar bills. And then we have F with the US flag and our lovely President Trump. D in some scandalous newspaper. And then we have I polling station, and so on and so forth. And there you go. You can do something, you can do a very complex grid with grid template areas. Pretty simple. It is tedious to write all of this and add a class, but it is probably the best way to handle a complex layout like this. All right, and that's pretty much all the layout stuff that you would probably need to know when it comes to Flex and Grid. There's a lot of use cases, and it's actually harder than most people would originally assume when it comes to understanding CSS. You think all these crazy animations can be hard, but sometimes the layout can be a headache if you're not taught properly. So I really wanted to emphasize in this particular application of how that works. So to top it off, I want to talk about position absolute and relative. So before we do that, we're going to do some cleaning. We're going to add some styling to this footer just to top it all off. We're going to do a background. We're just going to do black, make it easy, with the color of white, something simple. And we're going to do footer p tag. We're going to do margin of 0 auto so we can center it with the max width of 1500 pixel. We're going to do a padding of 2 rem, 4 rem, and we're going to also do text align, center. So that should center everything, give it some space, and we have it in our center. And actually margin 0 auto is not needed. I was looking at it. It's kind of redundant with text aligned, so you don't need that. All right, so the last thing I wanted to cover with this is going to be something called absolute and relative positioning. And I saved this for the very last thing because people are always tempted to use absolute and relative positioning for their layout concerns, but it should be their last ditch option when it comes to positioning things. It is the top positioning decision if you're using something like overlays. So if you look at the final application, when you use something like this and you're positioning over something, then you can use absolute and relative positioning. Same with over here. This is a relative positioning from the size of the image. So they're always going to be relative to the parent container. Same with this. This is going to be in the center of the parent container and it's going to be on top of it. But absolute and relative positioning should never be used for something like this right here. You can see home, news, gallery, articles. Now I just want to briefly go over why it's not ideal. So header comes with absolute positioning. You can say header nav. And I'm going to go back up to Flex HTML. I'm just going to put an ID and we're just going to say test. And then this is also going to be ID is equal to test 2, like so. And I really just want to show you what happens when we do it like this. Let's say we are using test as our ID and we are doing position :absolute. And let's say we position it, the right should be 5 pixel and test 2 should be position :absolute. And we should do, let's say, right 10 pixel. And let's just comment these two out so we can see what's happening. Let's actually change this to 200 pixel. So right here, when we have something like this, we are positioning both of them from the top and bottom. Maybe you can set this up with 150 pixel. The problem is when it comes to responsive design, it does not change and those are positions relative to it. So if you have another one, it's going to go and overlap with today, and that is a problem. Whereas Flexbox does not have that problem. And also, if I were to remove, let's say, galleries, what you would expect articles to do is move to the right and take up the space in between. However, with position absolute, it's going to stay there, which is not desirable. So generally, if I were to go back and see the behavior that it was without these IDs, and let's say I get rid of gallery, everything else aligns together. So it would make it so much easier when we could just remove gallery if we ever need to, and the positioning, we don't have to touch the positioning at all. And we can see that it will automatically, handle all the positions and layout and maintenance for our situations. So Flex is generally preferred over absolute and relative positioning. You generally use this for cases like I will explain very shortly. So to start off, let's go to this section, which is where we have this text. We're going to go down to our section. We don't have that just yet. So if you remember this part, this is where we have the class of hot card. What we want to do is set it up in a way where hot card is the parent component. And what we want on the parent component is going to be a position of relative. That's what the parent component should be. Now it doesn't do anything just yet, and that's because we need to set the hot overlay, which is this text right here, which is not visible at the moment. We need to set this position to be absolute. And when you put position absolute for a child element with the position relative for the parent component, then we can position the child one relative to that parent. So if I say bottom :0, we can see that the text is now going to be attached to the bottom of these images. So the hot card is positioning it to relative, and then you absolute position compared to that card. This is a very common pattern when you're putting something on top for overlays or items that must be associated with something else. If you need to position something on top and it needs to be positioned kind of close to together, this is when you would use absolute and relative. And you do have to set up your HTML kind of like this with one parent component, and the image would just be like, set aside, and you can just treat that as normal. But then for the text that goes on top of it, you want to do position absolute. We also want to set padding to be 1 rem and a background with RGB A of 0, 0, 0, 0.7. So the colors, it's a little darker. Oops, I meant to save here. You can see that there is like a overlay on the bottom. And the color, actually we don't need the color, we can just say font weight of bold. And there we go. That is how we do relative and absolute positioning of putting something on top of each other. And then from here, we're going to add like a little hover effect. So this is the final application. We're going to have a little hover over effect. Similar process, but here we do not have any text and we just have an image right here. So there is an alternative way, and we can use the before pseudo class like we mentioned before. So I'm going to call this masonry item, and that is going to be the parent component. So parent component with the image as the child. So we're going to do masonry item, position is relative. So that's the parent component. And instead of having a child HTML, we can instead do it a different way. We're going to do item : before, like so. This is a pseudo class. And like we said, we can just do content : empty string, which means there's no content in this one. But we can instead do position absolute with top : 0, left : 0, right : 0, and bottom : 0. We can give it a background of RGBA 0.0, just like that. Opacity of 0. A transition of opacity of 0.3 seconds ease. So this is a smooth little animations, but in the next line, we need to actually identify the hover animation. So we're going to do masonry item : hover : before. And we are going to set that to be opacity : 1. And as you can see, now we have our animation. However, we don't have the text of view story that we see in here. But as you can see, we can use the before tag to make that element instead of actually writing the HTML. It's just sometimes an easier hack if you want to do it this way. We're going to copy and paste this, and we can use the after class. This is for the text, and we're going to copy the exact same thing, except we're just going to have content for view story. We can set top and left to be 50%, so that will make it centered. So this is yet another way to center center an item, and we're going to set translate -50% and -50%, like so. Colon. We're going to set the color to be white, font size to be 1.5 rem, font weight to be bold. We can get rid of background, but we can keep everything else. And we want to change the opacity over here as well. This should be after. And now with that, we should be able to see the text as, and there we go. There we go. We have absolute and relative positioning. This is what you would use absolute and relative positioning majority of the time. However, there are specific scenarios where it might be useful to use when you're dealing with, if you know the fancy type websites, these are like designer type websites designed to wow people. They're going to have like very ridiculous, different layouts and different styling. This is where absolute and relative positioning can be important in these cases, because you generally, when you have elements like this, you have like a text over here, and then you have a car, and then you have another text right here. These are like diagonal. Generally, Flex is not ideal for situations like this. So those are situations where you can break the rule and just start using absolute and relative positioning. However, you do have to be careful of responsive design. And that's where I want to talk about the last topic of this section, which is media queries. So if we go back to the final application for something like this section, this is already responsive. We don't have to do anything thanks to grid. But a lot of other times there's going to be use cases like this one where when it gets too small, it looks kind of bad. But we wanted to make it so it's just one on top of each other. Same with news gallery. Ideally, you don't want like a long list like this. Like if it's super long like this, you would have to use a media query and you would custom do it. But I'm going to show you an easy way to handle it just by placing everything in one single line. And that will be super easy to do if you're doing all of this correctly. That's why I stress this foundational layout principle, because it makes it a lot easier to handle stuff like this. And so we're just going to finally go to the last section. We're just going to call this responsive media queries. And we're going to do at media screen. We're going to do and max width colon 768 pixel. Now you can have much more custom responsive media queries, but basically we're doing max width. That means right here we have a max width of 768 pixel. And when we get to a smaller screen size, we're just going to do one layout like this, one column. Now, generally, when you do responsive media query, you want to do mobile first design, which is generally min width. But in this case, max width is just an easier way to handle something like this. So let's say we have a header nav and we want to remove this when it gets smaller. Because if you notice, when you have home news gallery and they get too close, then it starts to overlap. So what we want to do is .header-links, and we can set this display, because if you remember header links has flex, we're going to set this to be none, so that when you go over here, you're going to see nothing. Generally, it would snap to like a menu icon for that, but we're not going to handle it in our case right now. We're just going to leave it be. And now for this featured section, we want this to snap over, and this needs to be on the bottom. Whereas currently in our application, this tends to spill over and it starts to cause issues like that. So we want this to be spilling down. So instead, we can do featured. We can do flex to be, or we can do display to be none. Sorry, instead we want to do flex direction to be column, so that they're going from top to bottom, and we want the height to be auto set and a gap of 2 rem, so that when we get to smaller screens, they're going to be on top of each other. So that will fix our issue when it comes to be too small for the screen while maintaining a responsive design. This is a very easy way to do it. Otherwise, you're just going to have to redo everything. Now we can go all the way here and handle this case right here with the masonry grid. Now, if you did it correctly, like I mentioned, this will be super easy. So all we have to do is call in masonry grid, set display to be block instead. Once we do that, once we get smaller, we just have all of them top and bottom. Now, obviously, you need some gaps between each item, so we will just do masonry dash item with margin dash bottom colon 1 rem, a height of 300 pixel. And so we have space between each one. So there you go. That's a very easy way to do responsive design for something like this. I can guarantee sometimes you're going to be in quick binds and you don't want to handle all the responsive design edge cases. And this handles majority of them. So sometimes maybe you want a custom design for it. Then you can specify and change all of this specifically for that. But this will handle a lot of the other situations because responsive design can get really. And then finally, same thing with the gallery grid. We're going to do .gallery-grid for this part, display colon block. And of course, we're going to do . Let's just copy this masonry item This should be gallery item instead. The height is the same. We can save it and we can see that it works as expected. We have the news gallery like this and everything is working as expected. And we can just change our container class that we originally had to be padding 2 rem, 1 rem. So it takes up more space. So when it comes here, we now have it hugging the sides because it's smaller screens. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This is a very important concept that a lot of people do not teach, and you should be fully aware of styling for CSS. All right, so with that, we have our application fully built and we have images, index.html, and styles.css. The last thing we need to do is deploy this application on a hosting platform, so Hostinger. So we're gonna go to our app 2, and then we're gonna go to Hostinger, our dashboard. So now if you want, you can replace the file manager and do it that way, or we can create a new one. And this time we'll use a temporary one so you don't have to pay for 2 domains or anything like that. So you can just do add website, create a website, go over here, we can say empty PHP, and instead of writing a domain name here, we can do use temporary domain. All right, once that's done, we're gonna go to our file manager. We're gonna go into public HTML. We're gonna click default.php and we're gonna hit delete. And now we're just gonna drag the files that we created onto public HTML. And there you go, we finished. We can now go back to our dashboard, click on the link, and now we can see our application easy with all the flex and grid that we saw earlier. As simple as that. And with that, that concludes all the CSS knowledge that you have to really know. You don't have to learn all the details. You can just go through, cut through all the noise, just learn these CSS properties, and for the most part, you're going to be okay. For the rest of it, you can learn as you go, searching up documentation on MDN, and everything else should go as you please, because a lot of people struggle with CSS. I still remember the community post where more than half of you guys said CSS is where you struggle the most. But if you know these foundations right here, you're not going to have that much issues with CSS. It is tedious and it does take practice, but I see way too many people spending way too much time trying to master CSS when they should go into JavaScript. They should learn all the functional aspects. They should learn backend. They should learn data models. It is a competitive market out there, and you should stop trying to master something that's quite basic and you can even let AI handle for the most part. So you want to go into more high level, more senior engineer type. Now, if you guys like this video, please tell me what you guys think of this type of beginner content. If you guys want more, I can focus on it and make it better. I just want to see what you guys feel. So let me guys know. I will still be creating, build an app, and I'm going to still do AWS content. So don't worry, it'll still be there. Anyways, see you guys next time.